No pressure though. No pressure.
No pressure. um, I don't even remember what I was going to say now. Oh, he addressed the question I was asking myself while I was reading it was basically like, well, I don't know. I'd have to get into a whole bunch of things in order to say what I want to say. But I've talked to people. I've talked to Michael Martin about eurythmy. I've talked to my friend Catherine about eurythmy because she did Waldorf and then sent her son to Waldorf. She's very familiar with Waldorf. Eurythmy is a big part of the curriculum. My youngest daughter went to eurythmy classes actually in Switzerland. And the idea, like, okay, so the theory behind eurythmy, I I I understand. Like I understand what he's talking about. The practice of eurythmy is a totally different thing. Like
Well,
it has to be learned.
he opened the
It is time for us to enter upon an age when what matters, rather than the actual words, is our experience of reality. And this transition from mere correctness of content to truth livingly experienced is to be brought about through the entry of initiation science into human civilization.
There is a new world that is being born right now.
And I would say you cannot understand something without initiation.
he opened the okay. Welcome everybody. Today I'm here with Nate and Sherry, and I'm super excited because I was doing some research on Steiner's eurythmy, which is a hard thing to explain, but perhaps not. And I came upon a Owen Barfield article where he wrote about it. I'm going to just briefly show it. The title screen, I should have been more prepared. Ba-da-ba-da-ba. Ba-da-ba-da-ba.
I'm leaving.
Um, okay,
At it. You're
right
not.
here. It's from an edition of the Golden Blade, uh, an approach to contemporary questions in the light of anthroposophy. And he wrote a little thing called The Art of Eurythmy. And it's pretty short. And yeah, and I turned to the two people who I would turn to in this case, uh, at least in my consciousness Congress, because to talk about it. And this, I'm not sure if you saw this, Sherry, but there's a little shout out to
I
Douglas Harding
did.
at the end here.
And guess what? I just downloaded Man or Matter by Ernst Lairs. I downloaded the PDF for
I'm
that
not
book.
familiar.
It's on the back. It's on
Oh,
that
that's
back page. It just showed Man or Matter.
that's true.
Because it's a dive into Goethe that I want to do.
I
I
see.
don't want to dive into Goethe by myself. I want someone else to dive in for me and explain it to me.
That's it. I'm not sure if you remember, but that's kind of why I actually the first thing I did, I was like, I sent it to you. I was like, I hope Sherry will do a reading of this. No, it's no worries that you didn't because you're very, you have lots of things going on. Um, but yeah, because I hate reading. I'm not a big fan of reading, so I was just hoping that somebody else would read it and then
Let me tell you what came up for me when you said, I'm hoping you'll read this for me and explain it to me. uh, my husband, our whole married life, when we were traveling, picnicking, hiking, anywhere away from home, or just standing somewhere together, if he had any garbage in his hand, he'd hand it to me. I'm like, and I would take it, right? I'd take it, and then I'd be like, well, okay, now what do I have to go to the garbage? I have to go find garbage now, right? And it became this symbol of someone that I had become that I didn't really want to be, right? Where people knew that they could hand things off to me and I would do them.
gotcha. Yeah,
No
that's funny.
question.
Yeah, that's funny. It also reminds
So
me
it
of the.
happens to me all the time, Jonathan. And when you said that, I'm like, I'm not reading that. He can read that himself.
Well, I'm kind of glad you did that because I read it and I'm very glad that I did. And that's very funny because it's also kind of on our topic of handing, that's a gesture. And like, it's
Yeah.
interesting because it's like, that we engage in these like gestures often unconsciously as well, just ex taking something from somebody as they hand it to you. And there's tons of stuff like this. Like, it's basically like the mirroring dynamic as well, right? So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, that's very funny. Um, okay. So, yeah, I
You know,
wanted to, or
okay, go.
no,
No.
go ahead, go ahead.
I would, well, Nate's still reading, so I just want to say the whole problem with that scenario was that he knew I would take it and say nothing. That was the deeper issue, right? That I'd take the garbage. Now he hands me his garbage and I'm like, ah.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is kind of like a main thing about why I'm so like passionate about all this stuff is because like that's the thing is that we don't see these dynamics and stuff and then we participate in them and then like to be aware of them
Mhm.
makes all the difference. And so and that was kind of to do I wanted to give a little bit of framing of like kind of what brings us here, like how we got to this point where we are discussing this. It's cool to hear that you have had other conversations about this and like that your daughter was involved in it and stuff. Yeah, like it's
Yeah, I've asked these people, what is eurythmy? And they're like, I don't know.
yeah. Or sometimes people will
What
say,
our teacher said I
Well,
should.
here's that's interesting. It's like the interesting part here is looking at this is I did not even know. Like this is from page 6 of of what you shared. In practice, musical eurythmy meets with the readier response from the public than speech eurythmy. And that's the only form of eurythmy I was aware of. I didn't know that there was anything other than the musical form of eurythmy. This was a disappointment to Rudolf Steiner, who regarded it as showing a lack of real understanding of what eurythmy is.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think I think it is due to the absence, where music is concerned, of this is really, to me, this is the crux of what I've read so far. This is kind of this part right here. I think it is due to the absence, where music is concerned, of the particular obstacle I have been stressing. In music, there is no
right.
obvious duality between the sound in itself and a meaning conceived as separate from it. Whereas in speech eurythmy, the overcoming in some measure of this dichotomy is a condition precedent to its appreciation. And this is something what the eurythmists cannot do for themselves. They should be able to begin about where it leaves off. It is for the poet to reunite meaning and sound, and for the reader or reciter to restore to sound some of its gestural quality. These are problems into which I cannot enter. It may be that the future of the art of eurythmy depends on their solution.
on the poet's solution? Is that's
On the solution of those problems.
Oh, on the solution of those problems.
Yes.
Okay.
He then says, it is certain, however, that if we wish to understand and appreciate eurythmy, we ought not to approach speech through music,
Yeah.
but vice versa.
Yeah. Which would be like the foundational. We've talked about that before, Nate, with the foundation of speech being music, right?
Right, but see, but that's interesting though. Here, this is why what he says here is counterintuitive to me, because he's saying it's like if we wanted to understand why Steiner was disappointed that musical eurythmy landed more with the public than speech eurythmy, he says that we need to understand and appreciate eurythmy not by approaching speech through music, which is precisely what you would think would be the case. So he says, but vice versa. So music through speech.
Yeah, because that's I think, maybe I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing there, because down further it says, but music as a whole is to speech as a whole, right?
Well, this is funny, but then he says that he agrees with what I would think would be my intuition and with what you started to say here, because he said this is also in accordance with the course of evolution, for there is little doubt that primordial language was richly varied in tone and pitch, and that song came before instrumental music.
Mhm.
Okay. Oh, okay, I see. So he's okay. Okay, now I do. So song, now I get what he's saying.
Okay, good.
So because song is the earliest form of music, that is what that is the that song being the earliest form of music is why he's saying that we should go through it the other way around. Because by going through it to the other way around, then we actually will have a better understanding of both.
It's when you first said that, I was panically looking for a little part where a little later he says, eurythmy should not be thought of as re-expressing what the music or words are expressing in a performance of but this is in the I should stop myself though, because this is in the context of when there's a eurythmy performance of music or of a poem or something, which is kind of slightly different context from what you're talking about. Um,
Well, I think
uh,
his point is that it's not a mirror, that it's not really merely a representation of the meaning, but that it's a um expansion of it. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
That the whole like there would be no point in if you read me in any form did nothing but represent exactly the same thing as the music that the music or speech that it accompanied, then it would be nothing. It would be just pure representation.
it would be like prose more
It would
so.
add nothing to the meaning. And what he's clearly saying is that no, there is there's meaning here that we could not get to without it.
Yeah, he says at one point that that the words are carriers of meaning rather than reference to the meaning, you know, like
Right.
and also that reminds me of when he's talking about it in the context of the language of the spheres or the language of astrology, or um he says that it's not an imitation of uh the cosmic word, but it's a response to it in a sense. Um, Even though we are born out of the cosmic word, he says that it's like it's more so a response in some way, such that it's of a different character. I'm forgetting exactly what he said, but yeah, no, I think that uh just to make sure I kind of caught what you were saying in terms of this connection about music. But yeah, so there are other types of eurythmy from what I understand, but the
Well,
main two were the music and the speaking.
right.
Yeah. Or I think
Um,
yeah, like he also had therapeutic, but I think that was kind of an application of either
you
of the
can
two
the speech
previous.
eurythmy is something that like you'll see this in a great preacher, right? You'll see this in a great preacher. It's so
Yeah.
like that's or you know or a great orator. Um, there is a way in which like it's not just the words. So the words on the page are part of it. They matter. Like having a starting with a speech or a sermon that is well written is important, but that in and of itself isn't enough. And you could have someone who was say less skilled at the art of speaking, or oratory, deliver that speech in a kind of cold reading off the page, and the impact is going to be, you're going to get less meaning from that, like you objectively less meaning than you are if you are kind of captivated by a dynamic orator or a dynamic preacher who is giving more body to everything that's on that page.
It's and he's talking about like the gestural quality of it, such that like the speaking is also gesture, right? And like it's that we've kind of disconnected from the actual like experiential meaning of
there's a line early on that I think makes me think that the giving Latin part, it's actually where he talks about the word. Where is that at?
Oh yeah, I wrote a note.
Do you remember what I'm talking? The part where he's actually talking about the word and creation and Genesis.
Yeah, and how like that was my favorite part. Like the eurythmic activity of God is basically, you know, what happens when God speaks the world into being. He performs eurythmy, particular movements. Like he's talking about the movement of God, and I think that's
I want to can you find that in the text? I would like to read that because I think that's important.
Yeah. Also connecting to the thing about music real quick was that it's that the meaning of music is kind of self-evident in terms of musical being more available to us, such that like nowadays the like we still have a direct experience of music, but when it comes to language, we abstract a bit. He actually says we're twice removed from the direct experience of language.
I found this. Okay, here we go.
Okay, yeah.
Here we go. This is actually,
I have so many bustling thoughts.
I finally found it. Okay, here we go. Since the Reformation, the mental picture which men have entertained of creation has become increasingly one of a single act of manufacture by God the Father. But according to St. John, the word came into being, the world came into being through the word. The Greek word which has been translated was made is the ordinary one for becoming or being born. While the Hebrew word used in the opening verses at the beginning of Genesis has the meaning of cutting or carving as well as that of creating. It is clear that a word which produced not only the audible, but also the visible or tangible world which we see around us must have been gestural as well as phonetic. What then would the gods do, said Steiner in his first lecture, in the first of his lectures on eurythmy as visible speech, if they really wished to form man out of a lump of earth? The gods would make movements, and as a result of these movements, capable of giving form to the dust of the earth, the human form would eventually arise. The human being, he continued, as he stands before us, is the product of the rhythmic movements which correspond to the sounds of the alphabet, etc. So what he's saying here is that the kind of like abstract post-Reformation whiteboard theological notion of creatio ex nihilo that we have, which is completely and pure abstraction, is not at all a picture of how God creates the world through the word, and that the sense of word that we need to understand is one that's fully embodied.
Yeah, and that it's also happening all the time, like that the world is continually being created. I don't know if he precisely said that in there, but that's what's really sticking out to me right now as you're saying all that, is how like, you know, the word like how creation is still happening like
Right.
yeah.
That we are, in a sense, participants in the divine nature ourselves, trying to remember how we did it. Some church fathers depicted an omnipotent God's free creation of the universe from absolutely nothing. Creatio ex nihilo. But Keller argues there's actually no or very little biblical basis for this ex nihilo doctrine. She tries to show that Genesis, in fact, describes a far messier, polytonal, and co-creative event. She calls it creatio cooperationis, creation by committee, by co-creative invitation, rather than mono-domination. She notes that Rashi also preserves the plural noun Elohim, which is usually translated by nervous monotheists into the singular, into just God. So then the first 3 verses, read in Rashi's way with this real attention to grammatical detail, should read this. When Elohim began to create heaven and earth, at which time the earth was tohu vabohu, darkness was on the face of the deep, and the ruach was moving upon the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." Rather than traditional commentators who point to the monotony, God said, God said, God said, of the creation narrative as evidence of its utter transcendence over any other merely mythic event, Keller focuses on what she calls the flirtatiously alliterative wordplay of these same verses. As Nietzsche referred to it, the monotonotheism of the ex nihilo tradition is replaced in Keller's reading with the participatory eroticism of Elohim's creative persuasiveness.
In the beginning, God revealed himself. He unveiled himself before non-being, and non-being repented and became creation. Non-being repented of its non-being and became something, because it was entranced by the beauty of God.
Yeah. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not exactly that we like imitate or kind of dissolve into the cosmic music, however you want to say it, but it's that we kind of...
To present the ideal human archetype, I must begin by finding a way to insert myself into its motions.
How does that relate to looking into the still water mirror at nighttime to see the stars?
What do you mean?
That's what ancient astronomers used to do, is they would look into a pool of water to reflect the stars so they weren't like craning
really?
up all the time.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It is kind of cool. I feel like there's meaning in it somehow. Tell me about it.
These motions through which man endeavors to imitate in space the movements of his heavenly archetype constitute eurythmy.
Kind of dissolve into the cosmic music, however you want to say it, but it's that we kind of, I would say, like in the call and response, there is a furthering of the whole thing in some way or something like that. But
there would be some creative role for creatures to play in composing the story, but there is a sense in which the divine gives the deep structure of the plot. I mean, Tolkien would say that we are sub-creators, and I think he's Catholic, and so is giving a little bit more power to the divine than, say, Whitehead would, where God's power is less as the sole creator, but more like the conductor, who's not controlling what music the orchestra plays and the members of the orchestra play, but nonetheless offering a kind of a potential score that would be beautiful, but that actually, I think the improvisation of the members of the orchestra actually ends up heightening the intensity and the beauty that can be achieved by not simply perfectly mimicking the divine plan, but I mean, and Tolkien has this too, and in his creation narrative, where he has the Iluvatar singing to the Ainur, and then Melkor kind of deviates from that, and then Iluvatar is able to reincorporate the deviation to an even grander, melody. So it's there a little bit in Tolkien. It's just, he's still Catholic at the end of the day, and so God is the big omnipotent creator. Whereas I think Whitehead leaves more room for creatures to not just be sub creators. Gosh, if I was making a mess in there, but to really be participants in the creative process.
There's a part of that. There's a part of the conversation on Lilith that Jordan Daniel Wood and Chris Green had with Derek Holzer on The Plunge that Luke keeps pushing, and rightfully so. It's a very good conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's an interesting part of that where Jordan Wood talks about like some of his critics referring to perichoresis as an empty term, essentially, which strikes me as like the kind of thing that you would do if you are overly abstract in your thinking, because the literal meaning of perichoresis is circle dance.
Yeah.
And this word describes traditionally both the interrelations of the Trinity, of the divine Trinity itself, and also the interrelation of the two natures within Christ.
It's super deep stuff we're talking about here. I'm kind of like
I have a couple of other thoughts.
Love to hear them.
Please,
Yeah?
yes.
I mean, he says that the Hebrew word has the meaning of cutting and carving,
yeah,
as well as that of creating. Yeah. And George MacDonald talks about creation for us, like the way that we create. God creates out of nothing. We create it in a recombining
Yes.
way.
I mean, Tolkien would say that, we are sub-creators.
Book from the Ground by Zhu Bing is a novel written entirely in pictogram. Symbols, icons, and logos tell the story of the day in the life of an office worker. You don't need to know any particular language to read this book. You only need to be familiar with the things around us. Let's read the first page. Our story begins on Earth in a city. There's a home and a tree. There's a bird singing. The bird sings and a man in bed hears that song, maybe joins in. An alarm clock goes off. The bird keeps singing. Maybe they duet.
We are kind of gesturing towards or alluding to not just referential, but maybe symbolizing, creating a window towards that particular happening, which again is ultimately reality. It's just kind of, we specify for usefulness. This is kind of the helpfulness of language, And now, to really point to your phenomenological felt experience with the language rather than just some, conveying the meaning of the words in a sort of alphabetic way. So, subcreation, that's, it's basically to participate with the creative happening, the creative being, the creative ongoing genesis, which is occurring, and in all of our language, and just to parade our being with the creative work of God. That is what I have to say today, and I suggest you give it a shot.
So we take things that already exist.
Your phenomenological felt experience, which again is ultimately reality,
and we put them together, and then with that, that thing that emerges from that is something new. But it's not made out of nothing, right? And I find that interesting because to me, the Hebrew word is almost indicating that there's also a process of taking away, right? Of removing, like a sculptor. And it stood out to me because George MacDonald often has, in his fairy tales, he often has scenes of people stuck in marble, and they have to come out of it, out of the stone, right? So in a sense, they're like a living dead thing. And then, so these are just some random thoughts that have been going around in my mind since I read the thing. Also, in The Spell of the Sensuous, he has a long chapter on songlines with the Aborigine people of Australia and how they walk these lines, which are essentially personal to them, and they have their own songs on the lines. And when the men are walking on the lines, their song is also their seed. Like, so this is really densely, as myth is, right? Dense, super dense. But their song is their seed. And so as they walk and sing their song, and their song is personal to them.
More room for creatures to not just be sub-creators, but to really be participants in the creative process.
It also makes the land that they walk their own. It belongs to them. So, and they also belong to a clan that is associated to an animal. So maybe they belong to the kangaroo clan. And if they whatever animal that is their clan, name, or the clan they belong to, they can't eat that animal. They can't kill or eat it. So other people who don't belong to the kangaroo clan can kill kangaroos, kind of thing. But anyway, the man walks the song line, and as he sings, his seed drops into the ground. And when a woman conceives, so a sexual union for the Aboriginal people is not how babies are made. It's how women are prepared to receive the seed of the man. And the child jumps up from the song line into her womb because that's his seed.
Actually, the divine mind and imagination is teeming with forms and is the realm of all possible forms, not just ones that do exist and have existed, but all which could exist. All the forms, everything we experience, everything that is part of our life and our experiential, participation in the world is to do with these forms that are ultimately in the divine imagination. And to reduce it just to maths, rather like the national curriculum at the moment, where art subjects are sort of withering away in Britain. I think it's this impoverished view, and when we recognize that actually the ultimate mind, the source of everything in the cosmos, is full of forms, it is full of imaginings, and that what we see in the natural world, the plants and animals, are within that imagination. It doesn't necessarily mean that God, I don't think it does mean that God imagines them and then designs them like an engineer, and like the 18th century view of the designer God, the clock-making God. I think rather the imagination is indwelling in working through nature, and that the forms of nature all have their own creative potential and imagination as well, and that there's this development and evolution of forms in the entire cosmic evolutionary process. And all these forms participate in the divine imagination and in the imagination of all the creatures in the world.
The child jumps up from the song line into her womb because that's his seed.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And so, and then there was one other thought that I had. Of course, George MacDonald, in his imagination essay, really lays this all out. He says the world is the human being turned inside out, right? And that whatever it is that we feel inside, we grasp from the appearances, from the figurations and the appearances outside, the representations, and we use those to clothe our thoughts.
It simply wears them, like clothing.
And so I just wanted to send you something really quickly to illustrate, because I always feel like I'm really failing at what I'm trying to say here, but I'm just going to send you this. Because David Abrams talks about this lizard dance that the Aboriginal people do. And they literally become the animal. And that's what all their dances are. All their dances are them as the animal, and they totally embody the animal. But what is it that they're actually doing? They're not just, they wouldn't go to the difficulty of doing that dance and having it as a sacred thing if it wasn't teaching them something more. So I think what they're doing is they're embodying creation itself, which is
archetypal modes of creation or something like that.
Well, they're embodying like if I sent you a video, if you want to play it, it's really short.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. But you'll see how detailed the dance is, how they actually inhabit the mind and the body of the animal that they're portraying. And to me, I think this maps directly onto what Steiner's trying to say about eurythmy. Okay? Because anyway, I'll just let you play it.
Sure. How does this look? Can you see like the flare?
They're embodying creation itself.
The literal meaning of parachoresis is a circle dance.
Not very good video.
For it is not just mimicry, nor mere dancing, but stands midway between. Mimic art is chiefly a support for the spoken word. If the need is to express something for which words do not suffice, man supplements word with gesture. Thus arises mimic art. It expresses the insufficiency of the words standing alone. Mimic art is indicative gesture. The art of dancing arises when language is forgotten altogether, when the will manifests so strongly it forces the soul to surrender and follow the movement suggesting body. The art of the dance is sweeping ecstatic gesture. We may say, mimic art is indicative gesture. Art of dance, sweeping, ecstatic gesture. Between the two stands the visible speech of eurythmy, which is neither indicative nor sweeping, but expressive gesture, just as the word itself is expressive gesture.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
So what I'm seeing there is, because from Barfield's essay, I couldn't find the quote right offhand, but there was an indicator for me in there that there is a mediatory role being played by eurythmy. Like eurythmy is a mediatory thing.
Similar in a similar way to the poetic, how the poetic mediates.
The poet lives and writes at the frontier between deep internal experience and the revelation of the outer world. There is no going back once this frontier has been reached. A new territory is visible, and what has been said cannot be unsaid. Poetry is a break for freedom. In a sense, all poems are good. All poems are an emblem of courage and the attempt to say the unsayable. But only a few are able to speak to something universal, yet personal and distinct at the same time, which is what you were talking about. We create a door through which others can walk into what previously seemed unobtainable realms in a passage of a few short lines. Yes. And so it's basically poetry in motion. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And that's what those dances are. But the interesting thing to me, if you look at it from the Aboriginal point of view, it doesn't just mediate the world to the rest of the world. Like it's kind of an outward show, right? Like one person can see an emu, the whole village can see the emu in the dance, right? So it's a messaging out of something, like a radiating out. But it also reciprocally informs you of you when you embody when you incarnate the animal.
Yes, just one final note to that. And I think that the need for it is felt within science. And the sticking plaster, as it were, to cover up this need is by the use of the word information. So there's a need for something formative in nature, and this has now become where people talk about quantum information or the informational cosmos and that kind of thing. I think the problem with that is that the word information immediately creates a kind of jargon-like fog in the minds of people thinking about it, because it implies information theory, which is all about bits and how you send messages down telephone wires originally, and it's now about how you process things in computers and stuff. Information is about putting form into things in formation. And I think it clouds the issue to talk about how you code the form and then retrieve it and transmit it, when we can actually think much more clearly and directly about form itself. So I think that one of the things we need to do is to get back to thinking about form itself and remove the fog of all this talk about information. I mean, it's useful in its own way, and I'm not saying it's totally worthless and all that, but I'm saying it occludes or blocks clear thinking about form. And so I think that's why in our discussion now, I think it's good that we're focusing on form itself, as we can immediately think about it, recognize it, see it, experience it.
So it's a messaging out of something, like a radiating out. But it also reciprocally informs you of you when you embody when you incarnate the animal.
And so at one point,
just to top it off, like just to round out my thought.
Sure, yeah.
A poetic relation is a marriage between the mind of a human being and creation itself, right? And here's the kicker for me, is that the connective tissue between those things. So the connective tissue for the Aboriginal and in the dance, and the connective tissue for the poet in his poetry writing, or the eurythmist in his dance, is Sophia. And that's what's being reciprocated. That's what's being exchanged, right? It's wisdom is being cultivated by these things. That's what poetry mediates to us. That's what the dance mediates to the village, right? And So anyway,
And also perhaps also in the sense where like Sophia is the things of this world, like insofar as like it's the it's the embodied experience which is also communicated. It's like it's like what are the because it's not just a representation of an abstract meaning, it's a carrier of an embodied reality, a lived experience. And like and
like
that carries across, and that's
in one of the readings we did for the sociology class, Pavel Florensky writes about the divine feminine that it is all integral and not merely. It's all integral creation and not merely creation. So, like, think about that. All integral creation. That's everything intertwined and not just creation, right? But it's literally made up of the relationships between everything in creation. That includes us and the stars and God. And right, like that is the wisdom of God, right?
It's a carrier of an embodied reality, a lived experience. And that's
the wisdom of God, right?
And
when
that is
you like when you embody the emu, you're not just looking at the sharp outline, and I think Barfield talks about outlines in that essay actually. You're not looking at the sharp outline of the body of the emu. You're in the body of the emu and you're looking for the thing that the emu needs. You're looking for the emu's food. You're afraid of the emu's enemy. You're the emu with a brood of chicks, right? And when you do that, you notice everything around you
differently,
as an emu.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's super deep. Like there's people have been doing this forever. Like this is a shamanic thing, right? Like
yeah, and I think most anthropologists in the beginning would look at that and just say, oh, that's just a way of telling stories. But it's not. It's a way of inhabiting creation itself and making the human being makes themselves aware of what makes the emu the emu. What's important to the kangaroo, right? Well, you don't know until you're one.
Now, here's the thing.
Wait a minute, Nate. I just sorry, Jonathan.
Okay.
This is kind of like that. You've referred to this so many times. Merlin changing Arthur into all the different animals.
And this is also how we connect to each other. To embody your,
yeah.
Like, and so Nate hasn't said anything in a while here, so I kind of want to.
I'm processing. I'm thinking.
Okay. I wanted to give a little bit of framing here as we kind of connected to the, what is the consequence of all this, like in terms of connecting with each other. I wanted to give a little framing about like why I've become interested in this and how we ended up deciding that we might talk about this. And I'll try and keep it, under 5 minutes, but basically also like to give a phenomenological thing and to kind of lay out some of my motivations. It's kind of like a dual purpose in terms of why doing this. Video one would be, okay, I'm going to get to the purposes after, but basically in 2016, I had some experiences on psychedelics, and you experience the thing that happens with psychedelics, the dialogos, the mystical oneness with everything, the opening of iconic vision and imagination where things around you reveal more than they usually do, the feeling of agape, connectedness. But there was a particular insight that I felt like I was tracking because, and I think it had to do with the details of my friendship with my roommate, and particularly in this sense that you were just describing of like being able to put myself in his shoes and like to understand what he meant by his unconscious words, basically, which were happening through his body.
Right.
And it was like this big insight, and I felt like I was tracking an object or something like that. And then like I had this one particular moment where I saw a cube rotating with an eye on each face of the cube. But basically the whole thinking and experiencing that was coming along with that was to do with this kind of dynamic that I was experiencing with my roommate about the music, like the visual aspect of speech, and the intimacy of eye contact, and how there's kind of an ability like that we can get better at this, basically, and how like there's kind of like we can get better in terms of almost like an ability, social, to get better with the social stuff. And that threw me into a world of chaos, because it's like, completely new experiences, big insight, no interpretive framework, no spiritual history or anything, and like so there's chaos and isolation, loneliness, separateness. And but then upon doing research and such, but yeah, to really emphasize that quick, it's like this kind of syncing up, seeing what you mean, something like that. And then doing online research and stuff, I found that other people have kind of been talking about stuff of this sort, such that like, linguistics is a very, some would say that it's a core topic, like, and then I found Terence McKenna, who was talking about basically the same thing. And then Griffin of the Galahad Adonis YouTube channel, like when I saw his cosmogram and a lot of the stuff he was saying, really I was like, this is very like he kind of saw the same thing from a slightly different angle. And then perhaps he saw it more in its totality, or I saw a particular aspect which contributes in a different way or something. And then Steiner, through him. And Steiner, when Steiner's talking about eurythmy, I'm like, this guy was talking about this phenomena, because that's the thing, is that eurythmy, as he called it, and which I tend to use because I think he was basically correct in what he was saying, as you were saying at the beginning, is that it's not a theory, like I was kind of framing it at the beginning. It's writing a note. It's almost like eurythmy as a theory of everything, like cosmogenesis and the world logos and everything, like the movement, the eurythmic movements of God and such. But the thing is that it's not really a theory of everything. It's almost like a practice of everything, like that this is what everything is doing in some sense. And yeah, so been learning about Steiner because I'm trying to like basically live in more accordance with this phenomena, which you kind of mentioned it on one of the recent live streams, Nate, where like there's a mystical thing that can happen when people are in deep conversation and they really lean into it. And that's when we sync up, we're on the same page, and like the depth of basically Christian type of communion, which is like, and that's the other thing, is I found Jesus, to put it in, common parlance, is that it's like, oh yes, also the logos is quite fitting to these phenomenological experiences which is happening. And there's kind of so the dual purpose in that respect is, one, to prevent me from going insane and to like maybe reframe what I looked like to the people who kind of saw what I was going through, is like be like, oh yes, what he was mad because he was encountering something that actually makes sense. He's not just mad. So perhaps that's a little bit vain, but that's one aspect. And the other one is because I think this stuff is important. And in terms of, there's kind of a looming thought about psychedelics. People get very touchy about psychedelics. And what I would say that basically is that that's the crazy thing about psychedelics, is that I don't mean to say I'm a prophet, but I do mean to say that people can have prophetic insights, whether they kind of mean to, or whether they're like virtuous enough to do that or not. And the thing is that you don't actually Roger has recently been comparing psychedelics to winning the lottery, but it's not. You don't actually like basically like you don't receive the prophetic insight unless you do all the moral work and psychological work after the experience of it, because to like have a prophetic insight is also to be able to articulate a prophetic insight, and that requires virtue and stuff of that sort. So basically that's kind of the impetus, is that I feel like I saw this thing which is super important and relevant to our particular time period, and I've been looking for language and people to talk with about it. and and it's at hand that we can, or something. I don't want to get all romantic, but that's kind of the, yeah. So yeah, and that's kind of the framing for this discussion, which I was planning to do at the beginning, but that's all. It's all right.
Jonathan, tell me if I have this wrong. But what I hear you describing is what a lot of people would call telepathy.
Something like that. Yeah. Mind reading.
Okay. I've had that. I've also had that. Yeah, I've had that experience too.
Yeah.
And it's like
I think everyone, the deepest moments of everyone's life is kind of bumping up against this mystical thing that can happen.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
So
I get
what's
excited.
interesting, so I'm wondering if the reason you're wanting to connect this to eurythmy is because maybe what's going on in telepathy is that let's say, I'll talk about it in combination with the psychedelic state, that you are you're able to interpret the non-verbal elements of our communication, which are significant, just with more facility than normally.
Yeah,
because your mode of attention is different, right? So it allows you to. It doesn't feel like that though.
Yeah.
Not for me. The experience doesn't feel like that. The experience doesn't feel like the experiences of just knowing.
Yeah.
Of just knowing.
That's reminding me. Sorry, I get
so I don't know.
The performer not only reproduces gestures but experiences them. In other words, they must be not reproduced but produced each time out of the very self of the performer.
In terms of what's actually going on, I have no idea. But for me, the experience has been one of just knowing. And I've conducted arguments this way. Where like someone's arguing with me and I'm arguing back with them. And somehow it's known that there was understanding of what went on. So yeah.
There was something you said there that triggered sorry, please, Sherry, if you want to say something.
No, go ahead with your thought. It's good.
Okay, there was something. How did you start that thought, Nate? It was something about before the thing about.
Oh, I was just like kind of like trying to figure out how they might be connected, and so saying that maybe what's actually, did we just lose Sherry?
Hopefully not. I think maybe she.
Oh, her camera's just okay. She just had to turn her camera off for a second.
I'll be right back.
Okay, no worries. What I was saying is that
I remember.
It was speculating that the possibility, like what might be enabling that experience that feels like it's telepathic, is that what's actually being picked up on is all of the nonverbals that we have going on all the time that we don't normally necessarily interpret as well, because our attention is focused in such a way that we don't notice all the various other communication signals that are going on at the same time. I'm like, could that be the cause of it? Like, if maybe.
I think so. That's what I think. And And
Okay.
The left and the right hemisphere and the relationship to language is also quite interesting, because the right hemisphere has control over things like humor, irony, things like style and poetry and music and rhythm. So if you're trying to pronounce accents, or you're trying to capture the intonation of language, that's what the right hemisphere is usually taking over.
I sometimes think of making a tape of like 500 ways of saying the word yes, but all mean different things. So intonation is really crucial for understanding an utterance.
it also, and the thing is that it's not just interpreting it, though. It's kind of like you were saying, it's kind of like an iconic vision. Like, it's to have the imagination to pierce. And it's not that like there's an objective meaning, right? Like, that's where it gets interesting. Insofar as there are multiple meanings of everything that's said. And part of it is also like how we interpret it. It's the relational aspect of language, or something.
That knowledge is a relationship between the knower and the known.
What is meaning? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that is actually, that's getting at personalist knowing. Isn't that weird? What do you mean by that is asking about your personalist knowing. That's what it's asking. That's what it is.
Or something, such that
Right.
like, as we have, as we can do the imaginal empathic resonance type of thing, then I think that it is through the visual medium, basically, like through the gestural aspect of. But the thing is, it's not just visual, and I don't mean to poo-poo the spoken word, because it's also a gesture. But I think that it's really the iconicity, and icon is, we think of it primarily in a visual context, but everything can be iconic, such that like that's the medium through which like it takes place, and that's like the word basically, and like the medium of mediums, Christ the Logos, as everywhere filling all things, and it's like we resonate with. I don't know. I'm spilling over my words here, but
no, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's
Yeah,
fine.
mind
This
reading
is
fits, and I think that it's like
This will be, there'll be like many layers of what a thought is.
We can read in the person's face what lives in his or her astral body. If you observe the face of someone speaking to you, you receive the person's eye with his or her words, and the other's astral body with the facial expressions accompanying the words. The astral organism of the head, which causes the changing features, is connected to an etheric organism, which is a wonderful image of the cosmos.
A little ignorance is bliss. You need a little bit of
Yeah,
fakeness.
but that's not going to happen, man. I'm telling you, that's the bottleneck. The
That's the
bottleneck is
end of society.
You'll need some catching up.
The thing is that, yes, that would be my answer. Is that's yeah, it's like and this fits with the idea of the
well. It's also, it depends on like where do you think the locus of your thought is?
I just finished teaching a course on the nature and function of the self. The self is massively, recursively dialogical in nature, and it is not monadic, and it's not monological. We don't reason best monologically, we reason best dialogically. Experimental evidence, we're just at our best. Or the work that, people are facing a wisdom dilemma, and if they imagine talking to a significant other, especially a wise other, they do better.
Well, first of all, what is your thought, and where is it located? It's a relationship between the knower and the known. It only seems weird if you're convinced that,
because if the words in and of themselves had a true one-to-one correspondence,
if you're convinced that whatever's going on with your thinking, it's contained entirely within your skull and going on within your brain.
Yeah,
and there's nothing else, and there's nothing else to it.
Which is what Vervaeke has spent a lot of time talking about, how we are fundamentally embodied beings, and he would say that we need to put the AI in the body so that it can be a real being, and it's an interesting thing, right? Which is that we think with our body as well, yeah.
Right. I don't know about the idea of giving AI a body.
I don't know either.
That's just...
Even the word abstract means comes from dragging something away from basically its context.
I don't know, Sherry, you signing up for that? Giving AI a body?
No, I'm not signing up for that.
Why do we need that?
Especially given the weird proclivities of some of the AI developers.
Yeah, and especially given the fact that we already have God incarnate. Like, we don't need to build the God. I don't know. I get ahead of myself.
No, yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
well, yeah, right.
We don't need to. We can access the wisdom of God, like Sherry was saying, through other people. We don't need to yeah.
Well, I would go further because this is what Saving the Appearances is all about. We can access the wisdom of God through all of creation. And so like oftentimes for me, when I hear a lot of conversation around these things, I hear it as being is it pro or po-centric? Anthropocentric?
Anthropocentric, yeah.
It's very it's kind of missing the point, because we are the mediators between heaven and earth. Okay, so it's like this stuff doesn't just like I can physically bond with an animal through eye contact. My sheep, my goats. Okay, so I'm not just learning about you or Nate or my neighbor by looking them in the eye and speaking, right? But I can learn about who Molly is, one of my ewes, by making eye contact with her. And she can bond to me. And then she can speak to me later about things that now matter to her because she knows that we are bonded, right? Whereas before she didn't do that. And I've talked about this before, and people think it's cute, sweet. It's not, man. It's not cute and sweet. It's sometimes it can take you to places that you don't want to go when they're suffering, and they take you with them. Okay. Which they do. And so that, like, this kind of openness to all of creation through the body. And when I was reading Barfield's essay, I couldn't help but thinking how what Steiner is really emphasizing is the complete unity between the mind and the body.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's this notion that the closer you get to God, the closer you get to nature.
That's what I was saying earlier. That's precisely what I was trying to say.
How we are fundamentally embodied beings.
Yeah.
Is that, and that's what, and it's interesting, and it's really interesting that he goes so far as to like tie this to both the idea of the divine word and the creation itself.
Right. And here's the thing, Nate.
Well, what does that say about God, if that's the case?
Animals already have that. You know, the animal doesn't convey meaning with words. It conveys meaning with its body.
Yeah. So yeah.
Which is what you're talking about.
Right.
They already have that unity between mind and body. When a dog wags its tail, it always means that.
But we almost universally, we have a conception of God as disembodied spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
because we are.
Okay, well, okay, but if God, like a God whose word that is eternally creating the world has an element of gesture and artisanship to it.
But
doesn't sound very disembodied.
Well, no, because isn't that the whole gist of act and one being the same thing? I mean, act and thought, sorry, being the same thing.
Maybe I don't know. I'm just like I can think of like my first place that I would want to go is to just say this would be just an even deeper level of taking Maximus at his word when he says that creation is incarnation, right?
Yes. Yes.
And if we tie that back to John to the prologue to John's Gospel, then we can start to see like what is really being suggested,
right,
about God.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
really like that. And Sherry, you had some, or or it sounded like you were about to say something there, Sherry. I don't want to cut you off. I feel like there's always good things coming, and I don't want to stand in the way of it.
Well,
There are always good things.
it's just that connective tissue is what enables that body to move. Okay, in unison with the mind, right? And I actually think that the terminology heaven and earth has to do with mind and body.
Sure.
Heaven and earth. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we're mediating heaven and earth, we're actually bringing ourselves into alignment properly. But that only happens, I believe, through repentance, right? Through metanoia, through evolution of consciousness. And that always includes, and this is why I'm constantly talking about this, it always includes a turning and facing God. And so when you make that movement with your body and your face, your mind and your body come into unity with one another. And that's what makes it such a eureka moment, because you actually feel that, right, in your body. So, but we're so disconnected from our bodies. Our heaven and earth is not united, right? It isn't.
It makes me cry. It's like
not to utter thought and feeling, not to share existence with their neighbors, but to appear what they wished to appear, and to conceal what they were, and having made their faces mask.
And so, and going back to what Nate said about disembodied God, then he just becomes the man upstairs. Just like we have a man upstairs, right? Like I have a man upstairs and he tells me all kinds of horrible things about myself, right? And if you're in psychosis, he tells you horrible things about everybody else too,
Observe the phenomenon of mass formation and emerging totalitarianism, the formation of a mass formation.
So, and that makes your body react in a way that is uncontrollable. Like the body, what was it now? I've been listening to Rowan Williams's book, Nate, Looking East in Winter. And I think it was Gregory of Nyssa, but I'd have to go back and listen to be sure. He talked about Gregory of Nyssa saying that the big universe is not the one outside of us. It's the one inside. Imagine. And that our bodies are the victims of our minds, not the other way around. Like, and it's
Tomberg says almost the exact same thing in Meditations on the Tarot, right? Where he talks about how the body is naturally harmonious.
Exactly.
Tomberg in this chapter, he talks about how essentially you have an Eastern explanation for evil and a Western explanation for evil.
Yeah,
Eastern explanation is tied to this idea of ignorance, and then he says that the Western version is that it's like a misalignment in the will.
Temptation would be impotent if it did not find a terrain already prepared in the human soul. The unfortunate misunderstanding locating innate humane evil in the body instead of in the soul is due to a tendency towards a materialistic interpretation of the biblical story of paradise and the fall. Indeed, if paradise is understood as a place on the terrestrial or material plane, and if the fall is similarly understood as having taken place on this plane, innate human evil cannot be understood otherwise than as biologically hereditary, i.e., that it is the flesh which bears it and transmits the seed of evil from generation to generation, then it is the flesh which is the enemy of the soul and against which one has to struggle. Hence, one disciplines it by flagellation, one weakens it by depriving it of food and sleep, and one scorns it and mistreats it in many ways. One is ashamed of one's body. However, it is the body which rightly has more reason to be ashamed of the soul inhabiting it than the latter of the body. For the body is a miracle of wisdom, harmony, and stability, which does not merit scorn, but rather the admiration of the soul.
He says, not in the body. Then he's like, well, what about where he's moving on to try to locate what it is in the soul. And he presents that like two views. And
Right.
he said, and he tries to present because it's Thomberg, he tries to create a synthesis of those views.
Yes. Yeah.
And one is ignorance and the other is a misalignment of the will. It's on page 436.
Okay.
He says, let us now to return to the problem of innate human evil. What is it? It is ahamkara, the sense of self due to advigya, primordial ignorance, caused by Maya's power of projection, associated with Maya's power of obscuration, which contains the illusory identification of the true self, Atman, with the empirical self, as clearly attested by the revelation of scripture, direct authentic experience, tradition, and inference. This is the answer according to the ancient wisdom of India from the mouth of Shankara, the author of this summary and synthesis. It is desire engendered by ignorance, which consists in attributing the central role to an illusory mental construction of the self, whilst the center is nowhere or everywhere, answers Buddhism. So this is his description of like the left wing of which it's obviously he's drawing from Eastern sources here. And then he says the other current of tradition, the right wing entity of wisdom, if you wish, the Western Egyptian Jewish Christian current, gives another reply. According to it, innate human evil is not due to primordial ignorance, but rather the sin of knowledge at one's own instigation instead of through God. So that's like some kind of like movement of the will.
Yeah. Can I jump in here?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it's reminding me of something that was
Well,
also
just
said
one more thing, because of Jonathan and his clips, the body cannot lie, right? That's why people can read body language and see the inconsistencies.
And what is truth? Truth, that's the logos, which is that God doesn't lie, and God is like the body. It was reminding me of how in that Lilith conversation, this idea was raised that like God's will is what we want, but like, and what we would naturally do, but like we often do what we do not want to do. And it's kind of like the idea that the truth of the logos is always revealed by our body, but we impose and we basically mess it up. And like, whereas if we kind of found that alignment and harmony, we would be, exemplifying, we would be incarnations of God's will.
Who you really, really are.
One actually helped me to make sense of that original experience, in the sense that I didn't understand how the thing that I saw. I had this one particular moment where I saw a cube rotating with an eye on each face of the cube, and connected to the insight that I had about human relating. The logos of you or something is always apprehendable in your eyes, basically. It's always shining through, like that archetypal state, like shining through. And maybe there's a way of also like be incarnations of God's will.
Who you really, really are.
And
this is why Maximus says that Christ has a natural will but no gnomic will, because the natural will only knows the good.
Right.
This is why Maximus says that Christ has a natural will but no gnomic will, because the natural will only knows the good.
Right.
It only knows the good. It only desires the same thing that God desires. It's our gnomic will that creates these false choices for us that we give importance to.
The one that deliberates. Yeah, and so this is why it's so interesting.
Well, it's the one, you want though, Sherry. It's the one that's trying to do what God does,
which contains the illusory identification of the true self, Atman, with the empirical self.
So it's like we have it for, so there's a way, it's like we have it for a reason,
It's the
and
Luciferic aspect.
it needs to be redeemed, because there is actually there's power in it.
It's the Lucifer. I think of it as the Luciferic aspect. I associate mysticism with Lucifer.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up.
and also Venus, such that
the Venusian, when it's divorced from the solar, can then become Luciferic.
Whereas the more corporeal side is the Sophia side, which is the embodied side, and the natural, the body being, and but yeah, like the Luciferic willfulness of thinks that it's
It's desire to have it's ultimately the desire to have a world that's your own, that you've chosen for yourself, regardless of whether it has any reality to it or not.
Well,
because it's yours.
There was one guy there, a Pentecostal, I think he was, and he brought his virtual reality headset so he could go to church and what they call it, the megasphere, the mega world, that virtual reality, whatever that thing was that Facebook
like a church,
was
like in virtual reality.
Yeah. And what he was doing was they would meet, all the people there would meet virtually, and they would have their little worship service. And he thought this was awesome, and he said this was the future of Christianity. I said, no, it's not.
What I'm thinking about right now is Adam and Eve when they eat from the tree. And they look down at their body and realize that they're naked. Okay. So it's like for the first time, they're aware of their body.
Who told you that you were naked?
Yeah. And so it's
the
like
psychedelics.
So then they go out
personally.
This is what we talked about a long time ago, Nate. Then they get kicked out into the thorns, right? That is the thing that pierces their body. And now I just lost my train of thought, and I had I was going to tie that together with okay, the whole idea of deception and deliberation. We deliberate because we're afraid of making the wrong choice, right? And we're afraid of making the wrong choice because we're afraid of being deceived. But this is why I keep pointing back to, but the whole story starts with the deception. And that deception leads to an awareness of your body. Okay. And that seems to me to be a path that gives you the opportunity to bring both mind and body, heaven and earth, into alignment with God's will, with God's mind. Okay. But you can't do that until you feel your body. You got to feel it, because otherwise you don't know it's there.
I'm tempted to make a brief advertisement for psychedelics. Obviously I would have to be very careful in doing so, but I really think that
you got to feel it.
There is a place for like a proper use of these things where it's like that you are intentionally encountering that more autonomous, corporeal, death and renewal type thing.
And it's through death. It's through death that happens. We know that as an individual in the world, when we marry and commit to living for our spouse, we're immediately confronted with all the things in us that need to die.
And
that seems to me to be a path that gives you the opportunity to bring both mind and body, heaven and earth, into alignment with God's.
And that
it's very plain to me. It's very plain to me that Christian objections to psychedelics are purely artifacts of culture, and that there is no divine mandate against them, unless, well, first of all, if they're illegal, and you're supposed to obey the laws. So there's that. There's that. That matters.
Big words come from anarchist.
Yeah. Well, no, Christian anarchists don't break the law. You actually obey the law, pay your taxes, keep your head down, and just don't have anything. Don't participate in government as much as it's possible for you to not participate in government.
Have you done like a conversation specifically about that?
He's not just the image of the person who accepts suffering, but he's also an image of a criminal being crucified. So he's both the judge, of all things. He's the Son of Man. Has all this glorious imagery, but at the same time, he is the crucified criminal outside the city, right? You see it you can see it in the opposition in the story where Christ goes into the temple, clears out the temple, right? Acts as this holy scourging fire, which purifies everything. But then he's taken outside the city and he's crucified. So it's like, bang, those two radical opposites just jam together. And Christ always manifests that fullness of the hierarchy, where he's both the top of the hierarchy and the bottom of the hierarchy at the same time.
Because I'm very intrigued by this.
It's happening soon. I've started to talk about my politics a little bit more lately. I think now is a time when it's like better to talk about my politics than it was in the past. Because I think we're at a window of time where I think I'll be less misunderstood. But that's beside the point in this case. Unless the only thing that you could say is like, if you kind of want to do like a Christian variant on the stoned ape hypothesis and suggest that actually that there's some sort of connection between psychedelics and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah, I was just kind of joking when I
then
said
that gives you a that actually gives you a little, but I don't think most people want to go that far in order to just
basically replacing Jesus with Jesus was a mushroom. No,
it's not. Yeah,
it's not so simple to say that they ate psilocybin mushrooms and suddenly the brain mutated. I think it's more complex than that, but I think it was a factor. It was like a software to program this neurologically modern hardware to think, to have cognition, to have language, because language is essentially
Jesus. To put it in, common parlance, is that it's like, oh yes, also the logos.
Just like the snake winding up around the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there was a temptation that was made, and the temptation was to stand up on two legs instead of go around like a gorilla and start to rearrange your sense organs so that you would be able to move and live more freely, not like an animal out of basically your own astral desires, or as an automaton just looking for food. And they started singing, which created speech. So standing upright. Later, human beings were divided like the Tower of Babel, and they needed to learn how to speak and learn how to speak the language of nature. So Christ looked down from his throne on the sun and said, we need to go down and intervene and stop the forces of hindrance, the forces of evil, Lucifer and Ahriman, impinging upon human senses. And we need to salvage and redeem human senses and cause the human being to stand upright so that it will be later a vessel, a vehicle for the I am. So standing upright, they needed to learn how to speak. And they started singing, which created speech. So that happened. That was the first cosmic deed of Christ.
So if there's no absolute prohibition against it,
there's only a prohibition against divination. So, and like all things, it matters what your intentions are.
Correct.
They needed to learn how to speak.
That's precisely what I'm saying. So it seems to me that like Roger just kind of goes too far, in my opinion.
To perceive differently, and to me that's exciting. That gives us a chance to escape from the machine and go into something else.
Well, I want to use that as a jumping off point to talk about something that makes a lot of Christians today uncomfortable, but it's something we have to talk about because it's reality. I'm talking about psychedelics, LSD and ayahuasca, DMT, things like that. These are booming. So many young people, and not so young people, are using them. It's wild. You feel this connection with everything. It reinvigorates your life, et cetera, et cetera. I have to testify that is true. These things work. It happened to me when I was in college, long before I became a Christian, but I was very depressed in my freshman year over a girl. I was so locked into my head. I was becoming an alcoholic, actually, because I couldn't deal with my despair. And then in my second semester of freshman year, this was 1986, I had this new roommate in the dorm, a happy Jewish hippie from New Orleans, and he and I dropped acid together. By then I was so depressed, I was like, I don't care, I'll put anything in my body. And it really changed me. It took me completely out of my left brain. It helped me perceive what I think is really there, which was the fundamental unity of all things. And I felt God so near to me. And Rupert Sheldrake, an English scientist, has a very interesting perspective on these things. He said very few people who do psychedelics come back and say, oh, I just hallucinated that. Rather, people who do them feel that, as Huxley put it, the doors of perception have been opened, however briefly, and they close back. Well, in my case, when I did it that time as a freshman, it pulled me straight out of my depression, made me realize, wait a minute, God is present. It was an experience even more intense than Shatra. And it sent me that Monday morning, the Monday after this happened on the weekend, I went straight to the college bookstore to buy books about Christianity. So I've not told people about that over the course of my life because I do not want people to go to psychedelic drugs seeking enchantment. It happened to me, but God protected me. It happened to me, but God protected me, I believe now, from a lot of spiritual danger. Psychedelics are dangerous not because they don't work, but because they do. Because spirit and matter interpenetrate, I believe these things, by affecting the chemicals in our brain, do open us up to a world of spirit. In my book, I talked to people who had been part of the occult and who had done a lot of psychedelics, who strongly warn against doing them because you will go to places that you have no business going to. But I think that we have to be fair, we have to recognize that people are turning to these things because, as Paul said at the beginning, they're desperate for some sense of mystery, of the numinous, of the transcendent. The problem is this is a cheap and easy way of getting it. I compare it to, say, someone becomes a multimillionaire because they've worked all their lives, worked hard, they've saved, they've invested, they've been disciplined, and become rich that way. They have a very different relationship with money than someone who became a multimillionaire by winning the lottery. We see lottery winners, often their lives get destroyed within 5 years because they don't know how to handle the experience. I think there's an important analogy that can be made with psychedelics there. But this is something that a lot of respectable, middle-class, older Christians don't understand as what's happening in the world today, that so many, not just young people, young students, but middle-aged people are turning to these very, very powerful drugs in search of the numinous. And they don't have to do that. You know, we in the Orthodox tradition, certainly, and in the more mystical traditions of Christianity, we have the truth. We have the true access to this. But if we deny it, if we downplay it, then people who are craving it will go seeking out this false enchantment through psychedelics. And frankly, what I've learned about the role psychedelic experience is playing in the growth of the occult has been fairly terrifying.
He was certainly concerned that if people would open themselves in a naive and unprepared manner to that sphere. He says, the sphere where the paint is made or something like that, He basically says, as you say, you get enough of this, like if you're attuned to it, you get enough of this in daily life. And that every realization that you bring back from the other side, so to speak, from an encounter with the numinous, has a corresponding responsibility associated. So you have to. So he's really a great thinker of integration in this sense, which is something that is increasingly emphasized and needs to be emphasized in the discourse, the current discourse surrounding psychedelics. But he's basically saying, you could definitely learn a lot this way. But if everything you learn is going to come associated with work that you have to do to integrate that, and so don't be in such a rush to inflict the burden of all this integration work onto yourself. Right. You may not be ready for it.
Yeah, Roger just kind of goes too far, in my opinion, and I think that the church needs to have an honest and serious conversation, particularly about the medicinal use of psychedelics, in as much as that can be done legally,
well, theoretically, they could just
and
be
within
like,
reasonable guidelines, because they really do help heal people.
You know, the thing that we normally identify in ourselves as consciousness or intelligence is actually, I think, only a small subset, or kind of like almost like this, like the tip of the iceberg of what our true intelligence is. You know, this little rind of neocortex that is developed, you know, in the very, very recent and geologic or evolutionary terms past for us, which is, you know, mediates our sort of linguistic and conceptual understanding of ourselves and the world. That is a very powerful tool that we have in our consciousness, but it's not the entirety of our consciousness. And in fact, I think it's a smaller part of what our whole consciousness is. And so, which is to say that this linguistic, conceptual mind, so to speak, that we have, which we ordinarily think is the sum total of all that our intelligence is, it's actually not the sum total. It's a small portion, and the sum total includes things like the non-verbal, non-conceptual intelligence that's in our bodies that arises in things like dreams, symbology of dreams, arises in symbols and images and visions that arise during psychedelic experiences, and arises in somatic feelings that arise just in ordinary lived day-to-day life and are intensified in psychedelic experiences. All those things are manifestations or signals from an intelligent system that is us as an organism. And then I would say even deeper than that is what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, which is, if you accept this idea that, you know, maybe matter has both a psychic and a physical aspect, and we have this sort of dual aspect monist conception of the physical world, and you can open to the idea that maybe the psychic aspect of that is non-locally distributed. Then that starts to open up this idea that a relational field between people who are in close proximity to each other can arise that has a sort of intelligence in and of itself that is greater than the sum of its parts. Just like our bodies are made up of cells that organize into tissues, that organize into organs, and each of those has its own sort of intelligence and purposiveness. We haven't talked a lot about purpose or teleology yet, but that's another, I think, really important bias that the conventional reductionist model has, which is to say that it is sort of allergic to the idea of teleology and purpose in biology. But I think more and more we're starting to realize that we have to account for that somehow. That has to be included in our concepts, the ways we think about biology and nature, because we just see evidence of it everywhere, right? There is this sort of teleology. It doesn't mean there's some, you know, sky god with a beard that's like sketching things out and like a blueprint. It's not that, in my opinion, but it does mean that there is an innate purposiveness and teleological nature to organic processes, which are manifested both physically and, I think, psychologically and psychospiritually for us. And so, you know, and so to say, you know, just like we can be made up of trillions of cells, and yet those cells somehow cohere into this unitive organism that has its own sort of emergent intelligence and purpose that is much greater than the sum of any individual part, of all of its individual parts. I think the same can be said when we have beings like ourselves in relation to one another, right? And so, which is to say that something very real is happening when we say like a contact high, right? Like we can kind of say that in a colloquial sense, and like maybe and not without being very rigorous on what we actually mean by that.
Couldn't they also just kind of surpass like the laws in the sense where they would be like, it's a religious, like that's what the Native Americans do, right?
Yeah, but they don't have any, they're not under, like, I don't know about the American Indian, but here in Canada, they can cross the border to the United States freely. They have free education. They, you know, they can practice their cultural, whatever it might be. Yeah. Although, let me tell you, there's a group from Mexico living on the reserve out here, one of the reserves out here, taking advantage of that. Just saying.
I see.
Yeah. There's a few of those. There's a few of those around that do that, and you know, it's like I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting
I
topic.
think it's not something that, like, I would say this. I have all kinds of concerns about, like, what would happen to them in an environment where they were legalized in our
Yeah.
consumer driven
Yeah, if the
culture.
church doesn't step in and be like, this is spiritual business, like,
Yeah,
We
I just
don't.
don't see that. I don't see that happening.
yeah, I don't know how exactly it would look. Yeah.
That's never going to happen. Never.
Yeah,
But
I don't
we
think
don't
that's
have the
gonna happen.
we don't have the cultural infrastructure to use psychedelics.
That's probably a really good way of phrasing it, I think. Like we don't.
Yeah, but I mean, you know what though? I mean, we have the cultural infrastructure around alcohol, and we still do a remarkably poor job with that, right?
No, but I'm talking about like someone who knows the potency of these things from a spiritual point of view.
Right.
We don't have that. We don't have those kinds of spiritual fathers and mothers.
I'm saying that we don't, that even in areas where we do have cultural experience, we don't necessarily show a lot of wisdom. And
I mean, I can
Well, there is
go right now to the government cannabis store and buy mushrooms.
Yeah, well, there is something about it which is inherently like you're encountering the kind of the chaotic, right? Like it's like you're involuntarily kind of doing the whole death and renewal type of thing, and like so.
Having a psychedelic experience is hard. People think that it's something you do for fun or that it's pleasant. It's not. You don't do it for fun, and it's not pleasant. It's hard. It's a difficult curriculum, and at some point I had the feeling that my trips began to sort of repeat themselves. I would land in a space and I would say, "Oh, being here, well, this is familiar. I know what these insights are." And the other reason why I really stopped was that coming back it started becoming devastating. The sense of claustrophobia, of being in this form inside a body.
The whole death and renewal type of thing, and like so it's
well, that's one of the things that psychedelics do for people, is it will remove their fear of death.
Well, I think I personally wouldn't advocate for the use of them, because I think that you have to have proper guidance to use them properly.
Yeah, I really think it's kind of like it's just the fact that we're inclined to make categorical, like I think generally speaking, I would agree with what you're saying that like people are not situated where it's an advisable thing to do. Like you have to be in a very particular worldview and context, and I think that's so important because otherwise you end up have years of chaos. And I know this. So
if you think propositional truth is where it's at, you definitely will be exploded to that notion.
Yeah.
Right quick.
For sure. Yeah.
The very first time I smoked DMT, I mean, it was without a doubt the greatest compressed moment of growth I ever hoped to go through in my life. I mean, I stopped being a Marxist. I stopped being a materialist. I stopped being a rationalist. And it took, 5 seconds? It killed those things. It cauterized them. It burned them out beyond any possibility of ever reconstructing them. Just they were gone. The evidence was too overwhelming, And when I came down, I said, I can't believe it. And that was all I could say for about 20 minutes. It was like ideological shock. I said, I can't believe it. I cannot believe it. I just can't believe it. I said, well, keep doing it. You'll believe it. But the truth was I could believe it. I couldn't stop believing it. And yet I had not been prepared. I had not thought that magic ruled the world from top to bottom, side to side, atom to atom, from first to last. It had just not been in my conception to conceive of that. But that's a very violent way to contact the Logos.
That experience of awe, of wonder, is a foundation for love and of sacrificial love, the love of a marriage or the love of the priest, that sort of thing, the things that cause us to change our lives. But if we don't take that experience and grounded in something, in a sacrificial commitment. We may not have what it takes to hold on during the darkness, during the times of loneliness, during the desert time.
So yeah, that's a nice digression about psychedelics. Wonderful. I wanted to. There was a couple other things. If I while you were speaking, Sherry, that like I was really thinking about when you were talking about, to bring it back to the topic of eurythmy, um, talking about talking with the sheep and stuff. I think the thing about this is that we're connecting to the gestural aspect of language, and what does that mean? It's that it's not just um, uh, it's that basically you can have dialogos with everything, like dialogos and like that kind of communal, um, conversational person, like I thou relationship.
Can I suggest something that actually ties us back to the psychedelic conversation and
Sure,
links
yeah.
these two things together?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of the interdimensional beings that people encounter when they use psychedelics are not extraterrestrial or demonic necessarily. It's actually the other myriad intelligences of the earth that we normally can't hear.
Hmm.
That's what you're talking to.
Mhm. Yeah.
Something about how like also the uh like the psychological beings or whatever, like um perhaps like the archetypal melodies which compose the symphony of our consciousness or something like that, where those ones are um like you would have like, I don't know, whatever archetypes like that, and these would be like actual beings. Yeah, that's interesting.
What is it that's lacking in the daimon that keeps it from being fully a person?
It seems to have an impersonal agenda. So if it were personal, I would say, well, the diamond wants to claim credit, but it doesn't. And also, there is no account for why it wants to go in this direction and not another. There isn't a nice, neat little story saying, well, if I do this and that, then that and that other thing will happen, and then we'll hold hands and sing the kumbaya. No, there isn't a story like that, if you know what I mean. It's instinctive. I hesitate saying that it's animal-like, but it's instinctive. It is not deliberate. It has a very clear sense of direction, but it's instinctive direction. It's like a force of nature. It's also morally ambiguous, like a force of nature. We don't get angry when the tornado cuts across a town and destroy houses. We don't get angry at the tornado and blame the tornado because it's impersonal. The diamond is like that. Like for me, at least, it's like a movement of nature. It has an impersonal character to it. It's instinctive, not self-focused, doesn't have a nice story to justify why it wants what it wants, and requires moral supervision.
Mm-hmm. Haven't there been some people that have done like research with like using psychedelics to attempt to communicate with like dolphins and whales and things like that as a way to try to bridge interspecies communication? I don't know if like what was that?
They should have just called me. I don't even need psychedelics for that. My dog said thank you to me this morning for the longest time. I had an experience. So I have this mare. She's 30 actually this year, and her first foal died in the night, and I had to leave it with her for about 3 days because I knew that she needed to mourn. This is not something that people practice. If a horse has a baby and it's dead, they take it away.
Even with humans, we don't do this.
But I thought, no, I'm going to leave it with her. I'm going to leave her with it. She needs to take her leave of it, right? So for 3 days, she tried to get it up. She called it. She walked over. She came, back and forth. It was very sad to watch. And she was like in my yard right here. And finally, I went out to check on her, and she came up to me. And so horses don't like it when you touch their heads or cover their eyes or anything like that. That's just a reflex. You just, it's a trapping claustrophobic. Horses they call them claustrophobic panicaholics, right? And so they don't like to be like, this is the whole secret of riding a horse is when you squeeze them with your legs or you do this, they're moving out from underneath that pressure because they don't want to be trapped under anything. That's how you get a horse to move forward. It's just playing with their claustrophobia, right? So anyway, she walked straight up to me and she put her forehead on my chest. And I usually cry when I talk about this because it was very emotional. And I would say for a good 40 minutes, I put my arms around her head and both of us wept together. And she didn't move. And I have been around horses for many, many years, and I've never had that experience. My horse will let me touch their faces and let me kiss their noses, but if I try to grab their heads, they don't want to have anything to do with that. But I just held her and she wept. I could feel it.
I do know.
All I could remember was a vague image at the edge of my mind of Roland sitting before me with his leash.
And one thing I wanted to say when you're talking about psychedelics and everything, when you are on psychedelics, you experience this. You're like, oh my God, the trees are talking to me. My dog is talking to me.
He shook his head and his voice dropped to a somewhat grimmer and more lugubrious register. But now you've filtered so much of it out. That's what the brain and nervous system are, after all, a filtration system. A way of reducing the totality of conscious communion to the manageable dimensions of particular, punctiliar, subjective psychologies. But now the filter has become practically opaque where certain aspects of reality are concerned. In the modern age, the age of the mechanical philosophy, you haven't much chance of seeing those luminous dimensions of reality where fairies tend to flaunt themselves. Once the mechanistic method became a metaphysics and a habitual way of seeing the world, so much that's truly alive and beautiful and mysterious was lost to your kind. Living spirits, especially my people, fortunately, never succumb to these frightful materialist superstitions. So I don't have to work so hard to pierce the veil of the quotidian and to see the radiant figures that dance under the blazing moon in the courts of that other kingdom.
The birds are everything's talking to me, right? Because it is there, and somehow the chemicals that these plants have gifted to us, they remove those barriers just for a time, and they show us that it's possible. But
they change your mode of attention is what they do. So
right.
that you're
Nate, like I can do these things without psychedelics, okay?
Telepathy.
Mind reading.
And I'm not magic. I'm just normal. I'm just a normal human being. But here's the thing, I believe it. I believe it. And that's why, like the other day, when I was talking to Jed, I said to him, because I was out sitting by the lake and I was thinking about fairies, and I was thinking, how are I asked myself, do you believe in God? Yeah, of course I believe in God. Do you believe in fairies? No. Right, if I'm honest, not really. What's the difference, Sherry? What's the difference? Why do you think you believe in God if you don't believe in fairies? And why do you think you don't believe in fairies if you believe in God? And I'm just having this conversation. And so I said to Jed, I said, do you believe in fairies? Like, do you? There's something about that threshold that we have to cross, I think, right?
A rupture of plane will occur. This is what you're after. The rupture of plane It means that you pass through a membrane of some sort and you're in a place.
A cognitive membrane that's holding you from seeing what's beyond.
Yeah, like that. You're just like pushed through.
And
I do believe in fairies, and I think fairies is one of the terms that you would use to describe what I was talking about like 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, about those
When
entities.
when those people, what people are communicating with the other intelligences that
Of
are
the
around us,
of the earth.
of the
Yeah.
earth. They're intelligences of the earth.
Yes.
I'm
And it
reminded,
is.
I'm reminded of, sorry, please.
Just,
Neutral angels, if you want to call them that too.
Well,
I think
you
the
know,
category of neutral angels fits the fairies very well too.
someone on the Discord.
And
was talking-
they're neutral, not they're neutral not because they have because they have no compass. They're neutral because they're not involved in the war between the hierarchies.
Have they helped you? Have they been benevolent?
These are two different questions, right? Have they helped me and have they been benevolent? Lightning can help you if you want to get rid of the tree in your backyard, but you wouldn't call it benevolent, right? I resist very much using the word benevolent.
That's why they're neutral.
I'm reminded of the so-called machine elves, which tell the elves are very similar to fairies in a sense, right? Like and what they would supposedly do, I've never done DMT, according to Terence McKenna and some others, be that they would tell you to reproduce they would say, do this thing, speak, and it would produce objects or visual representations of your speech, which is basically eurythmy. I feel like we interrupted Sherry.
But just 1 second. And what the elves are really interested in is this stuff which I call visible language. That's the whole point of the encounter, is to exhibit it and to get you to do it. Well, now, first of all, think for a minute about ordinary language. It's really weird. It's the weirdest thing we do. I mean, if you were looking for the thumbprint of God on creation, human language would be a good candidate. Because look, we're supposed to be some kind of animal who just went a little further than the next guy. But to get out of that Shakespeare and Milton is a pretty amazing accomplishment, hardly to speak of the mathematical languages that we generate. So something happened. Some people think only 35,000 years ago. Imagine if that's true. I mean, I don't care. Some people say 150,000 years ago. But to speak, to take small mouth noises and to turn them into signifiers for symbols and relationships, in spite of some people's enthusiasm for cetaceans and dolphins, I just am not overwhelmed by the evidence. I mean, to me, you know, it is a miracle to be able to speak poetry. It is a miracle. I mean, when Coleridge wrote, "And south and south and southward we fled, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice mast high went floating by as green as emerald." I mean, that's language, and it's magic. And we have a fascination, then we also paint, then we sculpt, then we write, then we create electronic databases, then film, television. Clearly, what we want to do is we want to communicate visually. And these things are saying there's a way to do it. Do it! And what they are doing with this visible language that they create is they're making gifts. They're making gifts for you. See what we're doing? See what we're doing? Do you want to do this? You can do this. Watch what we're doing. And they are speaking a language which is somehow puns, which are visual, which are multiply perceived by you on many levels. And as you direct your attention into these things, you have the overwhelming conviction that if you could bring a single one of these objects back to this world, that somehow you wouldn't have to say anything. You would just walk up to people and say, "Friend?" And people would say, "Oh my God, you got a piece of the action, the real action. We want you to do this, and because it will make you happy, because you will feel good. Isn't this a riot? Have you ever felt better in your life?" And all the time the elves are saying, don't give way to wonder. Do not abandon yourself to amazement. Pay attention. Pay attention. Look at what we're doing. Look at what we're doing, and then do it. Do it. And it's this thing where then everything stops and they wait. And I don't understand. Do we all have to be loaded on DMT all the time? Can you learn to do this? You can do it on the natch. On the natch, this can be done. We can do it at will on the natch. That's where we want to go. And I think that's where history is headed. What the Archaic Revival is about is a revivification of the Aboriginal dream time. We are going to live in the imagination. People say, yes, that's it. I know what you're talking about. I saw that same thing too. Well, that seems to me to mean that self-transforming machine elves is actually a step forward in language, and that the psychedelic issue is somehow linked to the evolution of language, and that we are not, and in fact the whole culture crisis generally is linked to a direct evolution of language. We have to change the way we speak about reality, and then it will be perceived as different. I'm less interested than I used to be in extraterrestrials, flying saucers, all of that stuff. I still access it regularly. But you see, I've turned from the question of indicating the presence of the other to the question of what is it like to be the person who indicates the presence of the other. And so I'm more interested in the transformation of the quality of daily experience when we are unstoned, or at least unstoned enough.
So that kind of is a mapping as well. I don't know. I tend to think about the kind of beings. Yeah. I don't mean to interrupt. This is also, I love this. And I don't know. Yeah. In terms of those beings and stuff, I don't know. I would think about that as those are real. Yeah. But it's just not real in the way we usually think about it. I kind of lost the thread of what you were saying. I feel like we interrupted Cherry.
Whoa.
The point I was trying to make about do you believe in fairies? There's something about that threshold that we have to cross. I think that conversation I was having with myself was that, and this goes back to this whole deliberation thing, Nate, and the fear of deception, is that you have to make the choice, right? You have to say yes to everything. I said this before.
I call them, and I think elf calling is actually a tradition in certain cultures. You set your mind in a certain way, and then you say, I'm here. Come in, little green men. Come in, little green men. And it begins.
I think I said it within a conversation with you once, Jonathan. You have to say yes to everything, but that doesn't mean everything. But yeah,
you really have to trust God. It's not like some sort of airy-fairy belief. At some point you do let go, and you really have to trust.
Well, and sleep is such a perfect illustration for that because, I mean, you could talk about it in Lilith, which is, you know, that's obviously going on, is you have to let go to sleep. But you could think of that with anything. If your mind is just rolling when you lay in bed at night, you can't go to sleep. You got to let that go, or you'll not be able to go to sleep. You have to let all sorts of things go, or else you can't sleep. But it's also with death. The mercy of death is that it's almost like at some point, I don't know, I think it's probably true, even though it's beyond your conscious volitional will, that like you acquiesce to your own death. You can see that even in old people sometimes when they just let go, when they're like, I'm ready, like I'm gonna go. And that's a willfully giving yourself up to something that requires faith, because otherwise you're going to hold on. You're going to hold on and you won't be able to sleep. But in sleep is the seed going into the earth. Unless the seed falls to the earth, it cannot be reborn. It cannot bring forth much fruit. And all of us have to do that. And Christ universalized the way to salvation when he overcame death. But he really went through it. This is a point I love to emphasize. And what I said in the last one is that I think even Jesus went through that. He wasn't like a rationalist utilitarian, because otherwise it would be mammon and it wouldn't be faith. And he would just be like, well, I'm going to God, but then God the Father's going to resurrect me. And then, like, that's not the way it works, because that's calculus. That's analysis. That's not trust.
Yeah. I don't know. It matters. It matters. It's like Mary's fiat, you know. I've asked myself the question, how many women did God ask before Mary came along? Because here's the thing, Mary actually noticed that God was asking her something. Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. That's a continual thing. Okay. He's always knocking at the door. And so how many women was God knocking at the door and they just didn't notice until Mary came along? But like I was talking to Stephen about this last night, and I said, but then again, everything had to be in place for her to notice.
Yeah,
right?
That's real. I feel like we could say that he was asking everyone or something, but it's like that is the thing that is also interesting with Mary, is that is the tradition, that is the humanity reaching its fullness in rising up to meet God, in a sense, you know, like that God is always asking to incarnate the Logos, but it's a matter of you have to create the virginal space.
Yep.
And like Mary was basically the first to do that and be like, oh yeah, God is calling. It's so awesome. I love it.
But here's the thing. According to Meister Eckhart, that virginal space is a place of no images. And this gets back to the beginning of our conversation, because I was thinking of this while I was reading Barfield. Because a place of no images is a place of no language. And it's virginal. It's a virginal space because a place of no presupposition, no images, that's the only place God can enter.
Anytime I hear no language,
I just don't agree.
I think remember, the thing is that the place of no images is the place of icons instead, which is that we only have images when we are materialists and we don't pierce the image, right?
We refuse to pierce the image that we see in the mirror with the imagination. And when Owen Barfield said, basically, when we refuse to pierce images with the imagination, we create idols, and all idols become curses.
Wow.
And that's why the mirror is this double-edged thing, you know, it flips depending on what I'm prepared to see.
Depends on what you mean by an image, I suppose.
He talks about archetypal images forming the basis of a dialectical discussion between the ego and the unconscious. And he says, look, these are not intellectual concepts that can be arbitrarily manipulated. And then he has this he says that the archetypal images are a psychic thou. And he has this really interesting phrase he uses, that they are immanent - transcendent numinous types. And so immanent - transcendent, so not transcendent, but they seem to, when we encounter an archetypal image, it does seem to point beyond itself to some sort of a something that's there, which is a bit like, this is Jung's Kantianism. It's like this X that marks the thing in itself that we cannot know, but we know it must be there.
Depends on what you mean by an image, I suppose. But I've heard that many times, and I've kind of just like, I don't know if I've never bothered to say I disagree with it, but it's nothing that's really ever particularly grabbed me.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, yeah, I just don't know.
There's something
Depends.
about there's
I
something
think
about which
maybe
is
my
corrected.
understanding, maybe I don't understand what he means by image.
There's something about it which really resonates with me as well, though, which is that like it's almost like the divine darkness in a way as well. It's like
it's
the place of no images is like I think about it as like pre-propositional being, essentially.
It's an unknowing.
Oh, okay.
It's an
That's even
unknown.
further.
It's a place of unknowing.
That's interesting. I don't know.
Like if I ask you to name an animal that has no name, or draw an animal that has no name, you can't. There's nothing there, right? If I ask you to draw a kangaroo, you immediately, like I was watching, like we have these programs. Like if I say Mary had a little bicycle, you thought lamb. I know you did, right?
Of course, yeah, we anticipate.
So it's like, how do you encounter God when you have all of these anticipatory, like when I go out riding with a horse, and I used to have this mare that every time she saw a gate.
But you can have, okay, I would, if Eckhart said no concepts, I would agree.
That's
but
what it
no,
is.
you can have image without concept.
Okay.
That's why that is precisely why I don't agree, because it is actually possible to have image without concept. You can see something and have no idea what it is that you see or how to describe it, and yet you see something.
I think it was Henri Corbin who suggested that the imagination is actually a perceptual system like sight or hearing, and we need it to perceive the inner realities, which I'm taking to mean the daimonic realities in this case.
So this is why I'm wondering what he means by image.
Well, here's what I think. First of all, he's the basis for this. What he's talking about is, and he's not the only one to talk about it, actually. But the basis of that is, first of all, God says you can't make any graven images of me.
Right.
And that has to do with setting something in stone. Okay. When you set something in stone, it becomes an absolute. It becomes a certainty. And God says, I am becoming.
This is God. See here, we can feel it and touch it. And
maybe
point
it's just
at
so
it.
simple as like the difference between graven and, like to have a graven image is something that's been like solidified in stone, right?
What I believe that imagery is it, because that's what it is. We have an image of something being graven into a stone, and that is absolute. What I think that is saying is that is antithetical to who God is, because God is becoming who he is becoming.
I never even made that connection that graven is like engraving.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did you think gravy?
Writing. Book writing. Or something like that.
Think it was a stone
Maybe not quite so far as, book writing, but it's like the letter kills or something like that.
Right. And then the other thing, I lost my train of thought now. The other thing that he's basing it on is lost it. There's no graven images and something else, but I can't remember what it was now.
Sorry, I kind of interrupted you.
Yeah, the no images is kind of like that's where I assumed he was operating from that. I'm also kind of like,
I know what it is now, Nate. It was no one can see my face and live.
Right.
But now we see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ.
They didn't say anything about Christ or about Christianity. They just put up pictures of the Shroud of Turin around and bus stops and things like that and paid for it. And there was no criticism. If they had have said something, this is Christian thing, and it would have been defaced, I imagine. Yeah. But the people didn't kind of know what it was. But I mean, the implication was that there's power in the face.
You perceive the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, but then I say, you don't perceive the glory, the face of Jesus Christ now, literally, historically, critically, with your objective mind as you analyze the facts of the past. You observe Christ now in the face of Jess, in the face of my children, in the face of Luke, in the face of your enemies. You don't see God in the abstract.
Like Moses says, he's seen God's face as you see your fellow man. We must identify the image.
It was, no one can see my face and live.
Right.
But now we see the glory of God in the face of.
And then we die. We die.
If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. This whole thing's about giving you a window into that. And I think that the cross is kind of the pinnacle of that. It's
Well, I heard it described, and I'm desperately trying to figure out where. Because, like I said, my brain is just not working. Jesus said it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of him. And he used that as a illustration of this title thing. So it, at one point, it was what was, what was going in, and now it's what's coming out. So there's this shift, and this shift is this metanoia.
But it's the evolution of consciousness too, right? Because
that's where it was from. It was Barfield that said this.
Because it's saving the appearances, right? Before it's the outward in, right? Like this ancient man is so formed by his outside. It's kind of like,
Thank you. Like Barfield is pointing out that these two movements happen. Like, to me, coming out of community into individuality is like being kicked out of the garden. It's at that point where Adam and Eve go look at see their nakedness, right? They suddenly become self-aware, and according to the first quote that I read here from Bulgakov, he says, in other words, in the incarnation and in the divine humanity, there must be room for death. So this process is the process through which we die, I think, right? And then the two things, the community and the individual, the unity and the multiplicity, right? The one and the many can be integrated properly. And it's through death. It's through death that happens. We know that as an individual in the world, when we marry and commit to living for our spouse, we're immediately confronted with all the things in us that need to die, right? Then we experience it as a parent, then we experience it as a mother-in-law, then we, and it just keeps expanding, right? You just keep dying as you are the individual, and the community comes upon you, and together you become integrated through death.
Yeah, the depths that are being revealed are God's intricate involvement in every detail of creation. Because this kenosis, this creative act, I believe it's God's doing it all the time for everyone and everything.
Yeah, that's why I say it's not an empty vessel. It's not an emptying of a vessel. It's a fountainhead. It's an overflowing. It's a never-ending, right?
Yeah. There's this rescuing of death as it still has this all this negativity, there's something beautiful that's been imbued in death itself through what Jesus does. And I think it's something that's so far culturally afield from where we are at, that it's not something we can meditate on too much, because it's something we kind of need to be confronted with, almost minute by minute, because so much is tempting us to construe of it completely in a completely upside down way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's just everywhere, If you eat of the fruit, you will surely see death, and that's what we've done. And of course we don't want to see it, so we put it as far away from us as we possibly can. I mean, I could look it up, but it's okay. He also quotes, I can't remember if it's the Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite? Is that who I'm thinking of? That in the silence the word is spoken. And he has a great part in that Christmas sermon about how can something be spoken in silence, right? But it's the word as this incarnational embodiment of God's will, which comes forth in his speech, right?
Almost like yeah. It's like the medium of the happenings or something.
Yeah. And I mean, I actually think that this space, the virginal space, it's always described as a womb, right? And so if you could remember what it was like being in there, it's a place of no images, right?
That has me thinking about the whole hidden fourth thing that I've been investigating recently, about like the womb below, and how
in order for there to truly be a cosmos, a unity in which differences are able to coexist in solidarity, then there must be a hidden fourth, as it were, which is not itself a form, but rather a formlessness which forms lose themselves into. In order for private, internal experience to be possible, the membrane of subjective interiority must come to being within a field of transpersonal awareness. Receptivity requires formlessness. A mirror is able to reflect images precisely due to the fact that it does not project an image of its own surface. It is the very formlessness of the mirror's surface which allows for such reflection. Modern consciousness, in other words, must come to reintegrate the hidden fourth, the inherent darkness, unpredictability, and indeterminacy of the world, the formlessness of embodied existence, a field of transpersonal awareness, which has been so long obscured within the metaphysical horizon of triadic completeness. The closed unity of the Trinity is only able to be world-generative in relation to the boundlessness of the quaternity, which is completed by the Marian face of the deep. In order for the Christification of human consciousness to be fully realized, the human ego must re-encounter the primordial womb from which it was born. The ego must be abyssated, taking on the formless form of the Marian womb, such that the light of the Logos can come to be rekindled within it.
The Trinity is perhaps like Sophia is the fourth in some way. In some way, perhaps. I don't know exactly.
Nate could talk way more about that than me, but
yeah.
I'm still working on the images, the no images thing.
I think there's something in it that is very correct, but yeah, I'm not sure.
Receptivity requires formlessness.
I love it because I've always operated out of the assumption that at some point there won't be any need for language. Not that we won't be able or that we will never use language, but we will know as we are known. So this telepathic thing that you were talking about earlier will kind of be the mode of being. There'll be like everything, like Douglas Harding
Yeah,
says,
but here's the thing though, Sherry. I actually
busted wide open to
the
one.
way I would describe that,
because that's all that struck me. It's just like the depth that can open between two people when we recognize that there is a whole spiritual world right behind, that we're busted wide open for each other, and it's so good, in my opinion. And I think and that's what's powerful because
and the way I would describe what I would consider spiritual knowledge is where there's a unity between seeing and knowing. Maybe no representations, but not no images. I just it's like
part uses no image.
Yeah, I know. I don't want to. Maybe he means it in a very precise way that I'm not following, but just like on the face of it, as I understand the word image, I would say.
Well, how do you understand the word image?
Yeah, that's a good question. I
I think the distinction is it a representation or like is it a symbolic image of like in the holographic sense? Like I don't know. That's where my mind goes at least.
What was that again, Jonathan?
There's a distinction with images, like if it's a representation, kind of like as we were saying, carriers
Right.
rather than reference or something. Like
Right.
Images, because images in like a holographic sense would be that the images do not just like.
So I guess
they aren't
I don't.
signifiers,
This
but
is
they're
really hard to
symbols.
do without using. This is really hard to explain. But for me, like, I think that to me, something's image. And let's think here where it says that we are made in the image of God, right? I think let's approach it through thinking about that. Like when it says we are made in the image of God, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're a mere representation of God? Is that all it means?
I don't
Or
think
does it?
First of all, I think that that's a misnomer because I don't think there is such a thing as a mere representation. That's what Barfield saving the appearances is all about. And this has to do with meaning, right?
So I fully agree that there is no. Okay, that's precisely why I don't want to say no images. Is because if you can have an image that is not in fact a mere representation, but you can have an image that actually, in seeing the image, you know the thing in itself, simply in the act of seeing it. To me, that is what pure knowledge is. That is how the essence of God is to reveal. To say that it's a place of no images is precisely the opposite of how I think about it.
I don't understand.
Well, what I'm saying is that there is image, and that image leads to understanding and knowing.
Are you thinking of
like
Christ?
For example, Sherry, like if I see you walk into a room and I see the expression on your face, I have all the information I need in that moment already without there being any need for any additional supplementation.
I want to connect
because I know you.
Yeah.
I want to connect this to what to the writing as well, because I thought it was really interesting how he brought up how the Eurythmist challenge is not merely the performing of eurythmy or the activity of the eurythmizing or however, but it's also that the onlooker, right? And I really like this how what you were saying, Sherry, about how like it's that like when it comes to like animals or other people or the things of this world, is that it's also it's really that for eurythmy to be, it also implicates an onlooker with iconic vision or something like that. Like there has to be both of those things for it to exist or something like that.
And this is something what the Eurythmists cannot do for themselves. They should be able to begin about where it leaves off. It is for the poet to reunite meaning and sound, and for the reader or reciter to restore to sound some of its gestural quality.
I don't mean to take us to interrupt the conversation about images, which I am finding very interesting, but yeah.
It's okay. We don't have to talk about that. That's kind of a
No. I was just just in case I didn't say it right. I was saying that is I don't know. That's reminding me of another thing, but I don't want to interrupt what we're talking about now.
Oh, I don't know if it's productive, or because
I'm finding it very insightful.
I don't know if it's productive at all because again, I'm not. I think that I don't know precisely what Meister Eckhart means when he uses the word image.
Yeah. Have you read it? Have you read the Christmas or watched the conversation I had with Jed about it?
I haven't had a chance.
Maybe you
I
should
think I saw a part of it, but not the whole thing.
Maybe you should watch that.
I could just go back and watch it for my own edification.
The other
well,
thing,
I mean, it just might give you more insight into what Meister Eckhart's doing because Jed understood it.
Yeah.
As a place of no images.
Something about
I gotta tell you though, I'm not a big fan of like Zen practices or a lot of the Eastern Orthodox asceticism that like puts an emphasis on that kind of thing. I actually think it's a mistake.
Oh. Okay.
I think there's interesting nuance. Like I feel that very much, Nate, but I also kind of feel like there's something to what Sherry's saying, which I think you would probably agree with, that there's some nub of correctness somewhere in it that I don't know, it's like a weird dichotomy that I'm experiencing as we're talking about this.
It has to be understood.
I think ultimately it all comes out of like Plato, essentially.
Not really.
Because
I'm learning this in Looking East in Winter, actually. It's not Platonic. And I don't know much about Plato, but
well, it is in terms of its it is Platonic in its resistance to in its resistance to representations. It is.
I don't know what you mean by that. Like,
that's like
it resists. I mean, the Orthodox Church is full of icons. It's not resisting.
Right. It's full of icons, but it doesn't like that is like a part of the step of a process, which the highest forms of mysticism within the Eastern Orthodox Church do have no images as their goal, just like Eckhart's talking about, right? This is also a goal of a lot of Eastern style meditation. And I just don't jive with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I just don't.
I think we have to. The bridge will be built though at some point, because there is an interesting thing going on here where there's like, I don't know. I really feel both sides of what's being said, but I also think it might just be kind of a semantical issue of like word choice or something like that. Like
it's highly semantic by its nature.
Yeah.
I mean, Rowan Williams
like these levels of abstraction almost.
Rowan Williams makes the point that he wants to talk about the Philokalia in a way that most people don't generally speaking. They have the feelings that Nate's having, but he wants what Rowan Williams does in the book is he says, let's look at it like this. And so you have to give yourself over to it in order to actually let it reveal itself to you, because from, if it's just a walnut with a shell, you don't get to the meat of it, actually. So, but anyway,
I have there's a line in this. Sorry,
yeah.
I thought you were done. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. There's a line in this which I really think was really coming to mind because particularly when you're talking about how like there's a place where language is no longer or something. That's very numinous to me. I don't know exactly what's meant, but something about that was reminding me about this part. So I'm going to read just this little section. It says, and I think you'll like the first sentence here. It's, for he, or more probably she, has to do the restoring not only with the mind, but with the whole body, and so that it is apparent in the subtle quality of least movements. Moreover, what precisely does this signify, this restoring of primordial speech gestures? Quick interjection, like you were saying about how the body is already doing what it's supposed to be doing or something, we intervene. But some kind of archaeological research of primordial speech, or some kind of archaeological research of primordial speech gestures. Sorry, the lines are like slightly wiggled. Some kind of archaeological research, perhaps, or a careful cunning of the descriptions given by Steinert, followed by accurate reproduction. As the smart recruit reproduces, oh my gosh, I need to use my finger here because the lines are weird. As the smart recruit reproduces the instructions of a drill sergeant? No, very far from it. It is not. I need to get a fucking ruler. This is pretty damn sorry. I forgive my profanity. Okay. It is not simply gestures that are to be made. It is gestures with meaning incarnate in them, gestures that are semantic in the way that words are. And this means that the gestures will not really be there at all, and there will be nothing for the audience to see, or rather there will be nothing it can read. No images, perhaps, to read. For a true spectation of eurythmy involves not only seeing, but also the kind of seeing through, which we call reading. There will be nothing the audience can read unless the performer not only reproduces gestures, but experiences them. In other words, they must be not reproduced, but produced each time out of the very self of the performer, a self which is, as it were, as we know, a somewhat forlorn proposition from the performer, which is in some sense a proposition which has emerged from the cradling spirit, which has fallen out of the word, which is accustomed to divide meaning not only from gesture but from sound itself. So like something about how maybe like not producing out of preconceived notions or images or something, but like to each time produce out of the marriage of heaven and earth, like out of the generative darkness, or the union of light and darkness.
Yeah. What I get an image of,
no images here,
is
I'm joking.
Goethe's leaf becoming the flower.
Here we need only remember the inner guidance of Goethe's doctrine of metamorphosis, which has not yet been sufficiently appreciated. Goethe rightly sees in the single leaf the whole plant. The whole plant is contained in a more primitive way in the leaf. And again, the whole plant is only a more complicated leaf. In each individual organ, he sees a metamorphosis of the whole organic being. And the whole organic being is a metamorphosis of its individual organs. For an understanding of the plant organism, Goethe demanded, quote, "Watch how the plant in its growth changes step by step and gradually led on transforms from blossoms to fruits." Close quote. Hegel wants to comprehend all world phenomena in the gradual process of their development, from the simplest dull activity of inert matter to the height of the self-conscious spirit. In the self-conscious spirit, he sees the revelation of the primal substance of the world, the end of chapter 7. The whole human being is a more complicated metamorphosis of a single organ system, the laryngeal system. Our larynx eurythmizes. If you understand how the whole human being is a metamorphosis of the laryngeal system, then you are able, with just as much validity, just as much inner natural necessity, to let a visible language, a visible song arise out of the whole human being. Just as song and language arise through an organ system, the same can arise through the movement of your limbs and through the movement of groups of people. We are embedded within the creative forces of nature. We immerse ourselves in the way the forces of humanness work in speaking and singing. And when we have these forces, we can transfer them to the forms of movement of our whole human being.
Right? So it's an organic movement where something, and actually Barfield talks about this in Saving the Appearances. I really remember this part because it really impressed me, was how Israel is given the name Israel because it contains the name of God. And they can't say the name of God out loud. But when they say their own name, and this is how Barfield puts it, it comes bubbling up from within them. Cool. Right? And I'm like, ooh, tricky God. You stuck your name in there, eh? That sounds kind of incarnational to me.
Yeah.
But anyway.
No, yeah, that's great.
And that's the kind of the same movement that I see with Eurythmy, and what Steiner's actually trying to communicate about it is that it's something that emerges up from a fertile bed of.
It is also feeling which stimulates activity in the larynx and its neighboring organs. It is feeling which is at work. The whole range of feeling, as it streams and strongly pulsates through the body, becomes incitement and an organ of perception. The whole range of feeling, with the human being as the instrument.
It's something that emerges up from a fertile bed of soil, right? So all the things that make it grow, it moves up and out, and the speech becomes, and those two guys that were walking and talking, footnotes to Plato.
Yeah,
I think he said something that Heidegger talked. Heidegger said something about that. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like the speech becomes the flower.
That the speech is the flower of speech is the flower of the mouth.
Right.
Huh.
There's a reason. Mm-hmm. And that's language is the expression of the reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we have all these, there's a whole, like...
The world elicits language in us.
Yes. Language is the flower of the mouth. I think Heidegger said that, but he might have been quoting...
Oh, that's pretty. I like that.
He might have been quoting Holderlin.
It's so true. That's so great.
Yeah. I think he was quoting the poet Holderlin, but don't quote me on that.
It reminds me of that, one of the, what they say, what people refer to as one of the first novels. It was written by a woman in Japan, The Tales of Genji, I think it was called. But it's so beautiful because back then, and I assume that there's similarities all across the world like this, that they speak in poetry to each other. And there's like this rich cultural context for the things that are said. And it was just beautiful to me. It was like life as art, truly. And it just reminds me of that, the flower of the mouth.
So this relates to Owen Barfield's theory of language, right? And the evolution of consciousness, that it begins as poetry, and prose is sort of, and the whole idea of metaphor is like, you don't really mean it. It's just as if, when you talk about, Apollo is the sun, or the sun is Apollo, or that spirit and breath and, Yeah, spirit and breath and wind are all the same movement, all the same being.
That's something more than just the sum of those.
Right.
Something different. Something kind of incomprehensible.
But what does Barfield have to say to us about language and our participation in it, right?
Well,
and that's exactly what I was just saying about the leaf becoming the flower in Eurythmy, right? Is that it's something that emerges up from a fertile bed of soil, right? So all the things that make it grow, it moves up and out, and the speech becomes, it's like this just imagine this, like this plant that's moving and moving, right?
And that speech becoming the flower of the mouth is a powerful image.
Yeah.
It is an image that conveys more than the origin. This is precisely why I can't get behind the no images thing.
Nate, it's not that you can't have any images. That's not what Meister Eckhart's saying. He doesn't say that. He says that the place where God comes in to the soul, where Christ is conceived, is a place of no images. That's a womb.
Okay.
That's a virginal space.
That kind of makes sense to me, right? That the place where
I'll read you. I'm just looking in it here. I'll read you where he says
the womb is the womb is basically what he's saying, right? Like, or I don't know.
I'll just read you a little bit of this, and it'll clear it right up.
No, it won't, but thanks for trying.
No, where he says that the soul has images. The soul has images, but there is a place within the soul that has none. Yeah. But I'd have to find it to read it.
Okay. I'm just going to sidetrack us more with my obsession over this.
I don't mind that. I really think that this is interesting. Like, this is very productive.
Let's talk about the passages that you read instead, Jonathan, because that's very interesting. That I found that really interesting because in other words, they must not be reproduced but produced each time out of the very self of the performer as self, which, as we know, is a somewhat forlorn proposition, which has emerged from the cradling spirit, which has fallen out of the word, which is accustomed to divide meaning not only from gesture but from sound itself.
The cradling spirit kind of reminds me of what.
To me, the only thing that, like, the thing that I think about two things in doing this. I think about, like, what happens when a singer is singing a song, right? Any singing which is merely a reproduction, is merely a faithful reproduction of the notes and nothing more, isn't going to really have much of an impact, right?
Yeah, and
it's going to convey far less meaning than someone who sings that song from a place within themselves that is absolutely authentic, where what they're doing is even though they might be faithfully reproducing the notes, but what they're actually doing is far more than that, right? So they're producing something in addition to that mere faithful reproduction of the notes and the words. So the song,
a more improvisational and even distributed sense of agency, where, you know,
there are particular song forms, there are particular songs, and those are templates for improvisation, and certain things are admissible and certain things aren't.
And this is the difference between somebody reading text off of a page or putting their whole being into it, you know, and that is eurythmy, or like, that is what I think is.
Yeah, I really do think I think eurythmy is like what I think that's like. Steiner's trying to formalize it and trying to get people to like get more attention to it. But the process he's describing is that people who are already skilled, like people who are skilled at reading poetry, people who are skilled orators.
He was absolutely marvelous. I just loved him. And I felt so at home sort of with him. And he had this twinkle in his eye, sort of a naughty twinkle. And he also was stubborn. I could see as stubborn as I am. You could tell it in his mouth. The whole, you could say the whole individuation process was on the stone.
A perfect cube. The cube caught my...
People who are skilled singers, people who are skilled the other thing I thought about was like acting.
Yeah.
Yes, restaurant servers know this technology well. Yeah. And but
also
skill, which is probably, by the way, of the examples I gave, acting is probably the deepest and most profound of all, because acting involves a full inhabitation and a full embodiment to the best that you can imagine.
Acting
it's
like
an imaginative act of becoming.
Acting
a great
like
actor,
acting like an animal, perhaps.
Well, yeah, yes, which is right. Yes, that Aboriginal dancer doing the emu dance is a better actor than a lot of people who have taken to the stage and acting in what we think is like his performance of the emu was a fully embodied, convincing performance of the emu, right? He allows himself to become the emu.
Entertainment, though. It's for the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom.
I'm getting around to tying this to why Master Eckhart is right, and I had to get about ultimately, and I think I do agree, but I had to resist first. And that is because all of those things that I'm talking about, they require some degree of kenosis on the part of the person who's performing the act. And you can tell that because it involves a flow state, and flow states are always many acts of kenosis, like that by their nature. That's why everything else gets shut out, and just whatever the thing is just kind of flows through you in the flow state. It's a little mini kenosis. And I would say that of those, it's interesting, and maybe this is why we love movies and television so much. The actors the contemporary actor, with using modern methods of acting, most fully and consciously practices that kenosis every time they come to a role.
And I think this kind of overlaps with the idea of the I probably wouldn't frame it in this way myself, except I think it's a good example of like I was just listening to what's the German idealist dude, Bernardo Kastrup, talking about the daemon and the daimonic realm. And one might think about it as the archetypal realm or the spiritual realm or the psychedelic realm or anything. And it's that like kind of lost my train of thought.
Well, no, because that's what art, like the artists of old, right? Like it's appropriate to talk about this since we're discussing a Barfield article. It's like, when original participation was still characteristic of the consciousness, the poet felt themselves possessed by the god in order to write the poem. And we now have a more conscious mode of creation now because we are no longer within that consciousness because of the withdrawal participation.
Like Jung makes the point that Christ is calling everyone to consciousness. And so he even says, I forget what the line exactly is, but it's something like Christ isn't coming to lay down a moral law. He's there to make it, he's there to call everyone to consciousness. And to the degree that you remain asleep is where he's finding you at fault.
But you can definitely see that, like, there's still like, it never completely goes away. I would say that, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I have a whole bunch more to say, but I've talked long enough.
I think this idea of the kenosis also fits with the.
Well, most importantly, it proves that Sherry was right, because like that's the place. The kenosis is the place. That is the virginal space where there has to, it can't, like, if there are still images remaining, then there's actually no place where that can arise within you.
One of Jung's big constant refrains is that you must not enter the encounter with the other. And of course, he speaks often to psychotherapists and to clinicians. So he's speaking about, first and foremost, the psychotherapeutic encounter. But that must not be first and foremost mediated through a set of general principles that you're clinging tightly to. The whole idea when you're actually encountering some other person is to get all of that out of the way and open yourself. And he says, he speaks beautifully and eloquently about making the whole of your personality available, such that, and having as expansive a personality as possible, such that whatever needs to be elicited by the encounter is available for elicitation.
He nearly loses his own mind being confronted with the way in which his prior approach had been overly conceptual, and I think really learns why he's resistant to giving general principles firsthand, like at a deep personal level. Like he really took that to heart, I think, as a result of his own encounter with madness, and really seeing the uncanniness and the deep chthonic forces of the psyche, making it very clear to him that you're not going to understand this in an objectifying scientific way.
Yeah, and again, it's such a massive emphasis that it's amazing that people they just completely ignore this in discussions about Jung. Massive emphasis on encounter first, relation first, and his huge emphasis on affect as an incredibly central to the process of psychotherapy.
So it has to be made ready. It has to be emptied out before.
And this is kind of like the idea of how it relates to maybe like death. Like there has to be a like true love is also dying in a way. Like I don't know how to.
I think that's the carving.
I don't want to oversimplify it.
That's the carving that he talked about in the very beginning of the essay, or that Hebrew word. Remember, the Hebrew word for creating meant to carve and something else. I can't remember. Cutting and carving.
So creativity for Whitehead, as he explains in the final chapter of Process and Reality, in some ways transcends God. Creativity is that ultimate relation through which God and world co-create one another, right? He says it's just as true that the world creates God as to say that God creates the world.
And I made the point that it's not just a putting things together, but it's also cutting things away from. So you get this image of a sculpture, of a sculptor sculpting a sculpture, and or a carver carving in wood. Basically, what they do is cut away what isn't the image. That's how.
That reminds me of
That's
this
all.
idea
That's
of
all negative space, and that is basically apophatic. Right.
That reminds me of this idea of restoring the primordial movements, such that like it's cutting away the things that are not God, which is already there happening, and like,
well, I think that's what the scriptures talk. In the New Testament, I think that's what they're talking about when they talk about the wheat and the tares, and they talk about the wheat and the chaff. All that cannot be shaken shall remain. Right. Like if you're a sculptor and you want to make an image of something, then you will take off what doesn't belong there until you have that image, right? Like you won't stop.
The idea.
According to this imaginary of bottomless process, The divine decision is made not for us, but with and through us. Amidst the chaosmic committee work of creation, what work remains for a creator to do, aside from its decisive delegations? Quote, let the earth bring forth, etc. Can we say with process theology that the creator emits an eros to which every creature willy-nilly responds? Some respond more responsibly than others to the cosmic desire. Committees and democracies make a lot of messes.
You won't stop.
The idea of taking off, I want to try and tie in a little bit here, like about just we could probably wrap up. Just I assume people are trying to get going and stuff.
I just wanted to say one last thing
but...
related to this use of the word to cut. So it's like our word to decide, right, comes from a Latin verb which means to cut.
Yeah.
So there's a way in which like this also implies a continual action of God in creation, as opposed to this idea of just like, hey, God created, it's all done, here you go. Whereas like
the unfolding of reality and the accumulation of facts in the history of the universe is not just about blind forces and particles colliding with each other, but there's a selection process. That selection means more than just a sort of accidental survival.
Sure.
After differential, the differential selection is not just a matter of like accidentally surviving because you happen to fit into that environment better. There is a lot of that. That's the lowest common denominator. But there's also eros, right? There's a kind of selection at the level of, again, like propositional feelings, where there's some sense of the some sense of aesthetic satisfaction that drives this process of self-organization across all scales of nature, all the way up to animals deciding which mate to choose, right?
Yeah, totally.
God's cutting is fully on display in the entire process of our becoming.
Yes.
So
this is really great because this is super Dialogos vibes, really pushing me beyond like anything I've thought before. And so like
well, I had to get past seeing why Sherry was right and I was wrong first before we get to another layer of the conversation.
You got there, Nate. I didn't expect to be right.
Well, it's one of those things. It's like I've kind of shrugged at and accepted uncritically, and I just had this momentary critical thought that I'm like, okay, if I do push back, let's see what the result will be. It's not like I was like super offended by what you said or anything.
No. Yeah. No, that's good. That's constructive.
I'm having like this numinous feeling where it's like,
what Jung means by the numinous, and he takes us over from Otto, is something autonomous. Basically, is something dynamic and autonomous. It's actually a kind of animist view in a way. It's animating principle that is beyond us and beyond the ego in particular, but nonetheless animates us, imbues us with a certain kind of organismal agency.
A big next step in the big puzzle is like right at hand or something. Something about the choosing and the discerning, like how that's the creative work, but it's also like the mind. We also want the mind of like no choosing, or in like the
here, I got something for you.
Like,
I just did the story of Cosmo. Okay. And I came to an understanding about what was happening in the Garden of Gethsemane. Thanks to George MacDonald. It's not my original thought.
Can I say this one thing before you go into it though?
Just remember Cosmo for me.
Okay, I will.
Because this is about the choosing.
Okay. something. It's about how I made a video recently called Eurythmy and Evil, and I think this connects to the idea of the hidden fourth as well, about how like there is a like the self-giving grail kenosis cutting away is also like the death and renewal vibe, which is I think what balances when you said removing, you said taking off the, I don't remember exactly what context you said it in. That's what I'm trying to not lose track of here. Do you remember what it was? You said something about um
Art, cutting and carving and sculpting.
and yeah, sculpting.
Take
And
you take off what isn't the image.
yeah, and also how and like you really talked about as visual as sculpture, right? Like Eurythmy is like a sculpture in a sense,
Yes.
in a sense, and and how to take off is also connected with this idea of like the mask and
The human face is everything. Yeah, everything. Yeah. And I think that the fate of Eros and romantic love is tied to the fate of the human face. That's why the
Absolutely.
mask for me was so horrifying. Saint Macarius, Christ is all face, all face.
Mhm.
And Fauci's a scientist, right? Scientist of that left brain type. And not all scientists are left brain, and I'm not against science, but a real scientist, which goes all left brain, they can never understand the significance of the human face, right?
to take off is also connected with this idea of like the mask and I think ultimately the Leviathan in a way.
This kind of makes me think about the garments of skin again, Pezzy, because my understanding is not, I would rather keep it mythological and call it Leviathan.
And how, but also this idea where you have the luciferic aspect of covering or like of basically like choosing to do things that are not the primordial movements, and that's like putting on the mask. And the evil that is required is not actually evil, but it is rather the cutting of the feminine side of God, basically, like to say that is not the primordial eurythmy, which is in the middle. When you go too far into creating your own movements or something, but then the true eurythmy comes in like it's like the it's also a cutting away. It's not just like a creative act or something. It's like, I don't know. There's an interesting thing there in terms of the balance, but I wish I could articulate better. But it's just very fresh in my mind here.
Well, I think this might help them. I have a feeling it might, but I don't know if it's going to totally connect.
Yes, Cosmo.
Yeah, Cosmo. So Cosmo has a woman in the mirror. I don't know if you heard the story or not, but there's a woman in the mirror in Cosmo's mirror, and he falls in love with her, and he finally can't take it anymore. So he creates a magic circle, and he does all this powerful magic and incantation, and he draws her out of the mirror. And she basically says that she wants her freedom, but she can't give herself over to him because she doesn't know. He has to let her go. And so, oh man, the way George MacDonald does it, her desire for her freedom is more tied to her desire for his freedom. Okay. He has to let her go for his sake. That's what she wants for him. And he has this moment where he thinks, oh, I've got her. Like, she's in the mirror. I can look at her every day. And I really need that. Right. He has this little flash, this little moment. And she immediately goes, oh, you don't love me. You don't love me. Right. And then when she says that to him, his heart is, it doesn't say this, but I can imagine. And he says, I will not wait to be willing. And he goes to smash the mirror. Okay. And when I read that, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what Jesus said in the garden. Not my will, but yours. Right. And rephrased, you could say, I will not wait to be willing. And then he set his face, right, for Jerusalem. And that's what Cosmo does. he loses her, he loses the mirror, he loses everything, right? Now, how does that make that? I'm trying to make that connect to your thoughts about what. Can you just
We're talking about also the
in that
creative act, the cutting in. I think
the
it
cutting?
also
Oh, and the cutting as choice. That's what I was thinking of.
is also artistic choice in a sense.
Well, yeah, but it doesn't matter what kind of choice it is. It could be a choice to have breakfast or not. Like, seriously.
There's some sense of aesthetic satisfaction that drives this process of self-organization across, all scales of nature.
It doesn't matter what kind of choice it is. It could be a choice to have breakfast or not. Like, seriously. I will not wait to be willing, right? Which is in essence a form of asceticism. It's obedience, right, to God, because Cosmo knows that he wants her in the mirror, but it's right to give her freedom, and so he moves in that natural will direction, right? And he doesn't allow his desire to possess something to make the choice for him, which is essentially the difference between yes. Mm-hmm.
That's I think it's interesting that you should say that, Sherry. That's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. This actually has to do with death too.
Mm-hmm.
That's the part that that's where
because the life that we are afraid of losing is my life. Right? It's my life. There is no fear of losing life in the fullness of the term life.
And it
but
it's not
it's a life that we feel that we have some sense of possession or ownership of, that we fear losing.
Thanks be to God for our lives. Thanks. Shut up. What a blessing it is to be speaking with both of you, that we can all be here today,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But well, no, but this goes directly to like what Sherry was saying about Gethsemane too, because that's precisely like Jesus doesn't like Jesus lets go of that for the sake of the Father.
Yeah.
Right? And even though he is life,
well, it's not lost on me that he says cup.
Right.
Let this cup pass from me, right?
Right.
Let this kenosis, or in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
It's an everlasting pouring out of, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But then he says, and I just, that line in Cosmo, it just like really made sense of what Jesus said to me. I will wait to be willing.
I will wait to be willing.
Beautiful. Because that's kind of like the centurion who says, help me in my unbelief, right? He just like, and George MacDonald, he illustrates this quite a bit in his stories. Like there's a scene in The Wise Woman. She takes this girl from her parents, and she's a really bad girl. And she sticks her in her cloak because she's unwieldy. She's screaming and throwing a tantrum. So she packs her in her cloak and she walks and walks and walks. Finally, she lets the little girl out of her cloak. And the first thing the little girl does is run away, right? Runs away into the woods. And she gets into the woods, and she can see the wise woman on the road, and the wise woman just goes, okay. She just keeps going in the direction she was going. And the little girl gets off, and she gets into the woods, and it's darker, and she gets scared. Right? And she turns. And as soon as she turns, and she can't see the wise woman anymore, as soon as she makes the turn, the wise woman faces her, and opens her cloak. And the little girl, in her terror, is blinded by her tears and running and running and running, and runs right into the cloak. And the wise woman closes the cloak, and then they continue on, right? And it's this moment of reciprocity that is almost simultaneous, that happens between God and the sinner, right? Where all you have to do, and I said this recently, like, I don't know how I put it, but something about if you just make, and it is basically, if you want to put it in eurythmic terms, it's a physical turn, right? It's just a tiny little inclination and then you're hooped, right? You're done, because you're gonna be carried by God.
That's the thing I was also trying to add in terms of the cutting away. It's like that's kind of I don't know, like there is also like there is kind of a receptive kenosis, letting yourself die aspect in a way, but there is also a choosing, intentional, creative, selecting or something like that, where, because I think that's kind of the distinguishing thing with like if somebody's reading the poem off the page, but then they can also choose it to say it in a particular way. But
yeah, but you have to. But
it,
here's the thing, though, is that the letting go,
yeah,
mm-hmm.
and the refusal of possession of it for yourself proceeds that. Like it is a precondition for the generative creative act.
Yeah, exactly.
Which almost is kind of the idea that like the womb was prior or something, like, and that God moved over the face of the, like, I don't know. It's very
Gregory of Nyssa says that we're just embryos. So guess where we are?
Yeah.
We're still in the womb, my friend.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I remember you saying to me at one point, like all life came from the feminine, like, which is, in terms of our phenomena, like,
well,
down,
yes,
when you bring it down to brass tacks, it's like it's kind of obvious, like, women are doing the birthing and such.
Well, it's not about women though. Like, it's not about women. It's about the divine feminine. And that's different, right?
Yeah.
But there has to be a divine masculine too, otherwise there's no life.
Mm-hmm.
So they're both important. And here's the thing, Eve gets taken from the side of Adam, right? In Christianity, it's a rib. In Judaism, it's the whole half. It's the whole half. And I think that we're in the process of putting those halves together again. That is the marriage supper of the Lamb. That is the bride and the groom, right? Like, that's the image. So the image of God is divided in a way that is conducive to opponent processing, right? Like, this is the Hebrew word for the wife, that she is a help meet. She is your opponent processing person, right? And that's why men say happy wife, happy life. because she will make them very unhappy if she's not happy.
And it's also the thing where it's also that it's not just on the side, but it's also on the below, right? You have which is that it's the body as well. And it's true that if you treat your, a happy body as a happy life as well.
It's so fractal.
Yeah.
Like, if you, that's why I don't want to use the term woman, and because yes and no, and it's everywhere, and like Michael Martin talks about it as the submerged reality, right? Like, so it's a hidden, like, and the divine feminine is hidden,
Yes.
but it will be revealed,
And men contain it. That's
totally.
That's an obvious motif in the Grail literature and in the chivalric literature in general.
Kind of the thing with like,
And what's your favorite character name? Baba Yaga?
I like Baba Yaga, but
Baba Yaga
are you thinking of Kundry and
is that a
she's sort of a Baba Yaga like figure to a certain extent. Yeah.
I'm just thinking of it as a divine feminine that is also very masculine, right? Like it's threatening.
Yes.
It's
for sure.
Of opponent processing as well.
Yeah.
And that's seen in the Green Man or the Green Knight. Was it the Green Man? Of the wife of the husband in the castle. I can never remember her name. The Temptress.
Yes. I can't remember her name either.
Those remind me of, when I read Teilhard de Chardin's Eternal Feminine, and he says in there, if it wasn't for Christ, mankind would have put me in the camp of evil. That really struck me.
For me, this kind of grounds out into the image of the tohu wabohu, because it's the primordial chaos, and that's sort of like, all right, there's the potential that there's the ground for all evil, and then God implants the word, the seed there, and then all of creation emerges from there. But that whole thing, it actually redeems the tohu whatever the word is. The formless void, and all of a sudden the formless void then is revealed to be Sophia and wisdom, then Sherry was reading something and had this excellent line that it was like talking from the perspective of Sophia, and was saying, like, if Christ didn't come and do what he did, all mankind would have thought me as evil.
Chaos for this Cartesian tradition is coded as threatening, as the unruly unknown that needs to be subdued and controlled. Chaos is even erased. It's replaced by nothing. The nothing out of which the omni-god of Descartes and Newton, the all-powerful theistic creator, created the world by fiat. God creates out of nothing. But what if chaos could be recoded, like Gregory of Nyssa's luminous darkness? An infinite fecundity rather than mere nothingness, a prima materia from out of which all order emerges and is resubmerged. What if creation could be recoded as the poetic interplay of chaos and cosmos, never one or the other reigning supreme, but a continual interplay?
Yeah, it's kind of the thing with like feminism now. It's that, like, we're saying that the divine feminine and women are, separate but very connected categories, and it's like that, such that when you reduce everything to the material plane, the reintegration of the feminine looks like it's all about women, but it's not all about women. It's all about the divine feminine right now in this particular, at this time.
You know what I would say, Jonathan? This is just how I would say it, and wonder what Nate would think of it. To me, the divine feminine means the thing that receives, right? That which receives. And
the formlessness into which form
transcendental light and primordial darkness.
Yeah. That's really the core idea of Goethe's way of looking at color, is that you have a polarity of light and darkness. And what produces colors is this interaction of light and darkness. Not that darkness is just some absence, It's a real thing. It has tangible qualities, and it has physical effects, not just psychological effects. Like, say you've got a bunch of blinds, right? And you have the light coming through the window, and a beam of this shadow is what actually goes through the prism instead of the light. And as the shadow ends up going through the prism and ends up getting projected onto a screen in the light room, you get this spread of colors, which are yellow, magenta, or cyan, or light blue.
Which is freaking crazy, because people don't usually think about shadows as containing any energy in them for light.
Yeah.
People don't usually think about shadows.
And so that's why the cup is so indicative of the divine feminine, because it is that which receives.
Lo the void, the womb below, and to her all the world is given.
And so that is what we are becoming. That is the bride, right?
Yes, that's right.
It's the open.
That's why it's mysterious. It's mysterious, and its hiddenness are because we are deeply, deeply connected to it. Ultimately, it is us.
Yes, and we need to be making this open movement, right, to receive God,
which is both a willing and a dying.
We form ourselves as the world has formed us. But we create this form out of ourselves as free beings. Thus in art, too, there is something redemptive and liberating. In art we are, on one side, individualities, while on the other side, we sacrifice ourselves.
Transcendental light and primordial darkness.
It's like an interesting harmony of both.
I will not wait to be willing is a dying.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. Because right.
Because you just killed the part of you that wants that mirror.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Or the image in the mirror.
Or the image in the mirror.
Right.
And then he ends up
the part of you that can't break that connection of your identity to the image in the mirror.
Yeah.
Like it's not who you are.
The palpable feeling here on YouTube recording. It's interesting. The medium comes back,
Well, everyone's gonna just jump on what I just said and just call me a Gnostic or something. That's so far
I
from
just
it.
mean in terms of it's easy to. I just mean in terms of it's easy to get lost in our own reflections.
The internet or social media wants to turn you into an avatar of yourself, right?
Like when we equate who we are with how we look, we basically create idols.
And then when you judge a person, you're ultimately judging God. Ultimately, like if you follow that thread or something like that.
But there's a tendency to turn oneself into an avatar and to interpret other people as avatars as well, right?
Idols.
You're talking about the real. I mean, this is the medium is the message, right? So anytime we get together in the real world, that's the kind of the antidote to that.
And I'm speaking
but
for
there's
myself.
two.
I'm not speaking for anybody else.
Stories about the mirror here, and if it wasn't for my wonderful friend Joseph, I knew this because I wrote a poem about it, about looking at myself in the mirror and seeing a truer person in there, one that I was afraid of. Okay, but Joseph shared some things with me not too long ago about just that. And this is what Douglas Harding is also talking about, right? When he talks about the mirror, you can look at the mirror and you can stop short of the image, right? Of the hardness of the glass. And you can say, that's who I am. Or, and this is what Eugene Terkin said the other day, you can pierce the mirror and you can enter into something greater than yourself, right?
Really, wasn't that great? Sorry, I thought you were done.
Well, and then Joseph was telling me that I think it was when they built the tabernacle, but I'd have to double check. They had these basins for purifying, washing hands for the purifying before going in. And those basins were made of the mirrors. God told them to make them out of mirrors. And the idea was to look into it and see who you really are. And that's what Douglas Harding says, who you really, really are.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, you know, that's why I keep saying the phrase, we make things holy by the kind of attention we give them.
Mm-hmm.
And I also keep asking my own self, do you believe in fairies? Okay. Can this be more than you think it is? Yes, it can. Yes, it
Well,
can.
I hope that the fairies will reveal themselves to you.
I'm only being honest with myself, you know, about, because that the big question for me, or the threshold that I stand on, it between those two things, between believing in God and believing in fairies, is basically standing at the mirror. I'm at the mirror. Right. And so it's like, do I believe in fairies? I don't know what that means. If, you know, do I believe in God? I don't know what that means. Like, if I ask myself those questions honestly, I don't have an answer, you know? I'm just being honest. It doesn't mean I don't believe in God and I don't believe in fairies. It doesn't mean that. But it means that I don't know what that means. Because I'm being brutally honest with myself about it. Because I think if I do that, then I can enter in more deeply, actually.
Yeah, that's what we all need, especially in these digital ages, you know, where it's easy to get stuck at the avatar of ourselves.
Oh, that's what it was,
Yeah.
Jonathan. It was that conversation with Eugene where I said, the interesting thing with in Lilith is Mr. Vane follows the raven up the stairs and he finds the mirror and he looks in it and he sees a landscape and he sees the raven hopping around, right? Mirrors are supposed to reflect something else, not have a different picture in them. And so he leans closer and falls through the mirror. Okay. And I remember saying to Eugene, it's almost as if there's a moment of like where you no longer have a choice. All you have to do is, and it's that same, all he had to do is lean, right? He just had to have that curiosity. And it's kind of like the same with the wise woman, where the girl just gets so afraid. She makes that turn. She doesn't know where she's going. She's running in the dark, terrified, blinded by her tears. And she lands right in the old woman's lap, right?
I am going to have to tap out.
Yeah,
it's been a lot of fun.
It's a good place to end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lovely
Good to see you, Sherry. Good to see you, Jonathan.
All right, y'all. Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for
You're
participating.
welcome.
And
see you both
let's
later.
chat again sometime. Maybe you'll get Michael Morgan involved.
Maybe. All right.
All right. Have a nice night, y'all.
Okay, you
wonderful.
too. Thanks, Jonathan.